Chapter 6:26. After wiping out a small village near the elves' border, Grimm and his group had gained a lot. The harvest of materials and resources was secondary. The biggest harvest actually came from the small nature altar. Moon water, also known as the Moonwell water, was a special spring water produced in the elves' territory. According to legend, moon water was a new type of energy produced by the elves by combining magic elements and faith energy. However, this energy was in the form of well water. To mortals, moon water could bring the dead back to life and heal bones. It was a miraculous medicine. But to spellcasters, moon water was the safest and most powerful healing and recovery potion in the world. Even if a spellcaster had exhausted all of his magic power, mind power, and physical strength, he would immediately be full of energy and vigor as long as he drank a bottle of moon water. His mind power would be so full that it would explode. Therefore, if a high-grade wizard could bring a bottle of moon water with him, it would be like giving himself a second life. It was not hard to imagine that when this magus was exhausted from fighting an opponent of equal strength, he would suddenly come back to life with the help of the moon water. The pleasure of torturing his opponent was not something that could be compared to ordinary pleasures. Although the magus world was of a higher level than the Faerun Plane, the magical energy potions produced by the Magi world still stimulated the physical body and stimulated the mental energy to increase the speed of recovery. They were not like the moon water, which instantly turned one's body upside down after drinking it. One's wizard power would explode, one's mental energy would be full, and one's physical strength would be at the peak. Moreover, the sorcerer world's mana potions had serious drug resistance. Swallowing too many at once would not result in a stacking effect. Compared to the moon water potion, the recovery index in all aspects was like heaven and earth. There was no comparison. Therefore, even in the sorcerer world, moon water was still a high-grade potion sought after by high-grade wizards. The price of the same amount of moon water was 10 times higher than a potion, but it was still in short supply in the circle of high-grade wizards. The only reason for this was that the original moon water was mixed with a large amount of faith energy during the production process. Wizards did not have any faith energy, so they could not use faith energy. Therefore, they could not replicate moon water in the sorcerer laboratory. Since it could not be replicated through witchcraft, the only way for wizards to obtain moon water was to plunder the elves. However, for the elves, those who had moon wells and could produce moon water in large quantities were usually large groups of elves. These communities were usually protected by gods. No matter how tyrannical a wizard was, if he went to the elves' territory and started a fight, once he angered the god behind them, the god's emissary could send a clone to destroy his or her soul in minutes. Due to the difference in the grade of the path of faith, the individual strength of the god's envoys would be different, and there would be a huge difference in strength between them and the god's main body. However, if a Tier 6 god focused a portion of his consciousness on a Tier 3 oracle, he could still slaughter multiple Tier 3 opponents effortlessly. Apart from anything else, their understanding and usage of strength and techniques were already enough for them to fight with a small force and slaughter in all directions. Therefore, the elves that were protected by the gods were almost forbidden areas for wizards. Once the elven oracles were provoked, no one would be able to resist those oracles who could cast terrible divine spells. In the power system recognized by Magi, divine power was a higher level and stronger power than wizard power. Only the power of laws controlled by great Magi could contend against it. That was why Grimm and the others were able to obtain some moon water in a small elven village near the border, which was more than enough for them to be satisfied. They filled 5 standard potion bottles, and each bottle could be sold for a sky-high price of 20,000 to 30,000 gold coins in the Magus world. Moreover, there was no market for such a price. No one would sell the moon water they had worked so hard to collect. After all, in a critical moment, a bottle of moon water could save one's life. No one would complain about having a long life. That was why high-grade Magi would rather hoard it at a high price than sell it. Of course, to Desira and the others, the value of the moon water was undoubtedly huge. However, to Alice and Grimm, the wooden statue was even more valuable than the moon water. Since they were honored to come to a faith plane ruled by the gods, as magi, they would be letting down their status if they did not research the power of faith, which was even more powerful than wizard power. Of course, if Grimm could go to the divine kingdom of the elven gods and ask for some divine crystals, and ask the gods to open up their divine kingdom for him to study, his research would definitely progress by leaps and bounds. It was a pity that once a heretic from another world like him was targeted by the indigenous gods here, there was no other way out other than to destroy him. Therefore, Grimm and Alice had very few ways to come into contact with divine power. To put it bluntly, there's almost no way at all. Although the divine power of the wooden statue they had obtained from the small nature altar in the elven village was not strong enough to form a divine halo, it was still an extraordinary item. One could imagine that the leaders of the elven village must have knelt in front of the statue day after day, year after year, and communicated with the god of moonlight through the wooden statue. After a long time, the wooden statue had been immersed in the power of faith of the god of moonlight all year round. No matter how ordinary the wood was and how crude the carving was, it had now become extraordinary and had become a genuine divine artifact. Not only could one obtain part of the characteristics of the god of moonlight's divine power by studying it in depth, but they could also find out the power of law and divinity the god was involved in. Therefore, the moment Alice found the wooden statue, she sealed it with the powerful power of fate. She was not stupid enough to research such a terrifying thing in such a dangerous and crude environment. If the god of moonlight found out that a heretic was peeking at her authority through the note of faith, she might just throw a divine punishment at them. According to the legends, the god of moonlight was a level 5 god, although the upper limit of the power transmitted into the plane was level 3. Level 3 power was still too much for Alice, who was only at level 1. After scouring the elven village, everyone immediately boarded the giant floating ship and left without hesitation. 2 hours after the giant floating ship left, a small group of elven hunters riding on Night Saber rushed into the elven village. What awaited them here, other than the raging flames, was the broken elven treehouse. As for the elves living in the village, they were either killed, kidnapped, or escaped into the surrounding forest. Not a single living person could be seen here. Search. Spread out and search. We must find someone alive and ask them what's going on here. As the leading huntress roared in anguish, all of the elven huntresses urged the nightmares they were riding on to rush into the surrounding forest. They began to use the elven tribe's unique whispering spell to call out and search in all directions. Soon, some survivors were brought to the leader of the huntresses, including the beginner-level female druid who could turn into a sheep. Kalshan, what happened? Who attacked you? Humans or witches? Why are there so many casualties? Didn't you place any sentries outside? There were too many questions, so the leader of the huntresses asked a long list of questions in one breath, and the female druid called Kalshan could only answer them one by one with a gloomy expression. Actually, at this moment, Kalshan still didn't understand what happened today. She was only ordered to investigate the strange movements in the southern forest with Sid. After encountering a group of strange metal life forms that were killing crazily, she stayed behind to continue monitoring while Sid returned to the village to report. Then the group of strange life forms suddenly flew away. When she realized that something was wrong and ran back to the village, it was already in ruins. Other than countless burning heads, there was not a single living person to be found. The leader of the huntresses asked another 2 or 3 elves, but most of them were muddle-headed and had no idea how the enemy appeared. They were stunned by the enemy's fierce firepower as soon as they arrived, and when they received the escape signal from the leader of the elves, they scattered like birds and beasts, fleeing to the surroundings. Unfortunately, most of the elves were defeated and kidnapped. Only a few of them were lucky enough to hide and escape. After asking a few more elves, the leader of the huntresses could not help but feel a little impatient. "My lady, I know how those bad guys appeared." At this moment, a hoarse and low voice sounded beside her. The elves looked over in shock and realized that the one who spoke was a little girl with a face full of soot and burn marks on her body. The leader of the huntresses had asked so many people just now, but she was the only one who had not been asked. It was because she was too young to know too much. But now this underage girl had given them the biggest surprise. "My name is Weena. When the enemy came, I was talking to Sister Leafia in the tree hall. Little Mulder was still alive at that time." At this point, the little girl seemed to remember her friend who had died and could not help but cry again. Although she was anxious, the leader of the huntresses did not rush her. Instead, she pulled her into her arms and used gentle comfort to calm her down once again. They came from the sky. They suddenly pressed down from above the clouds, and the metal battleship almost completely covered the moon. All of the metal men jumped down from the battleship. They killed many elves with strange weapons as soon as they came down. Sister Leafia and Brother Sid were killed by the metal men. Their metal shells were too thick, and the arrows of ordinary elves could not penetrate them at all. Only Sister Leafia's double shot could penetrate their shells. Big Brother Sid turned into a grizzly bear and died together with a metal man. He died so tragically. Before he died, Sister Leafia shouted for everyone to escape. I turned into a turtle dove and escaped. My arm was pierced by their weapon. That was the weapon they used to attack us. Chapter 6:27. While the elves were reporting the information they obtained from the little village, Grim and Alice were discussing a plan in front of the wooden statue. The giant floating ship was currently hovering on an isolated island 110 nautical miles away from the Callan continent. The island was not big, only about a mile or two wide. It was covered with black rocks. There was not even much loose soil, let alone animals and plants. Due to the rugged terrain of the island, there was no place for the airship to land stably. Grim could only let it hover 10 meters above the ground, quietly resting and reorganizing. He had just fought a battle and captured some elves, so he had to find a place to settle them down as soon as possible. He could not bring a group of captives around to fight, could he? That was why the floating airship dispatched a group of construction robots to dig out a small underground prison in a secluded spot on the island and stuffed all the elven captives into it. After lightening the burden, Grim announced that they would rest on the island for 3 days. There was no other form of entertainment in this remote area. Grim was only giving the wizards of his family a buffer to adapt to the upcoming battle. According to the information Poison Man Ender had obtained, Grim had a preliminary understanding of the locations of all the elven villages, towns, and cities within 1,000 miles of the south coast. Once Grim had digested the harvest, the Crimson family would launch a large-scale surprise attack on the elven defense line in the next 1 or 2 months. The targets of the attack were all randomly chosen. As long as they were not blocked by the powerful elves on the battlefield, with the floating ship's high altitude, the elves would not be able to stop them even if they wanted to. The south coast had a winding coastline that stretched for 30,000 miles. Even if the elves had eyes everywhere in the magic forest, it would still be difficult to stop the floating ship from entering from high altitude. If the elves wanted to defend the vast magic forest, it would be useless even if they sent out all the elven troops stationed in the central mountain range. If Grim was the commander of the elves, he would also be helpless against an enemy that came and went without a trace. The only solution was to shrink the defense line and move most of the elven villages and towns to heavily guarded cities. This was the only way to minimize unnecessary casualties and use the powerful wings of the elven army to cover the ordinary elves with low combat power. However, if they did so, the few elven cities would have to bear a huge pressure to survive. Moreover, they would have to abandon the vast magic forest to that mysterious enemy. Furthermore, if the South Coast Elven commander was really ruthless enough to do so, Grim would just run off with his men to wreak havoc in other regions. At that time, the other defense areas would have to face the same problem and unwillingness as the South Coast defense area. Of course, the elves were not like the goblins who could be bullied by the wizards. Looking at the internal composition of the elven army, there was more than one troop type that could pose a great threat to the airship. From top to bottom, the Green Dragon army was, of course, the most terrifying. Although the floating ship possessed powerful firepower, 3 or 4 Tier 2 Green Dragons were more than enough to knock the floating ship out of the sky if it encountered the Green Dragon Legion. After all, the dragons were recognized as the kings of aerial combat. However, with the arrogance and laziness of the dragons, the price they had to pay in order to drive them all the way from the central mountain range to the remote border to encircle some bandits was too great. Any elven commander would have to think twice before doing so. Therefore, as long as the floating ship didn't get too close to the large elven cities, the chances of encountering a group of dragons were very low. To put it bluntly, if the green dragons dared to be alone, Grim wouldn't mind sending out his family's dragon-slaying squad to complete another dragon-slaying mission in the Fair and Plain. Excluding the dragons, the greatest threat to the floating ship was the Elven Army's aerial unit. The Elven aerial unit consisted of Pegasus Knights, Hippogriffs, and large magical beasts, Chimeras. The Pegasus Knights selected a few elves who were skilled in close combat to ride on their Pegasus. They would use their speed to rush to the enemy's side and engage them in close combat. They used longbows for long-range attacks, spears for mid-range attacks, and elven swords for close-range attacks. They were proficient in all aspects of attack. The Pegasus Knights who performed outstandingly would be selected to ride on a mutant of the Pegasus clan, the Silver Pegasus. From there, they would be promoted to Silver Pegasus Knights. These Silver Pegasus all had some strange racial abilities. After grinding with the Elven Knights to the point of telepathy, they could even help the Knights derive a few powerful night battle skills. Unfortunately, because the Pegasus and Silver Pegasus were just a mutant of land horses that had been demonized, they weren't good at carrying heavy loads. Therefore, the Knights riding them couldn't wear overly thick metal armor. Otherwise, it would seriously slow down their flying speed. Therefore, most of the Elven Pegasus Knights and Silver Pegasus Knights wore leather armor. However, many elves who were born in the upper class still liked beautiful metal armor. It was just that in order to reduce the weight, they had no choice but to wear the metal armor a little thinner and make it hollowed out. Seriously speaking, this kind of aerial unit was extremely powerful against the human army. It could almost completely control the battlefield. However, it wasn't enough to deal with the floating ship. The archer magic machinery was covered with automatic fire guns. Although they weren't powerful individually, they had the advantage in numbers. Once they formed a barrage, even if the Elven Knight's basic strength was several times out of the archer magic machinery, it would still be difficult for them to get close to them and start massacre. Moreover, with the thickness of the battle magic machinery's metal shell, ordinary elven blades and arrows would barely be able to damage them at all. Only those powerful knight battle skills, or archer battle skills, could truly harm the battle magic machinery. Therefore, it was very difficult for a single archer magic machinery to defeat an elven knight of the same rank. Many times, the archer magic machinery would even be taken down by the opponent with targeted attacks. However, if 10 archer magic machinery were to face 10 elven knights, the archer magic machinery would definitely win, and it might even be a one-sided massacre. Moreover, the floating ship had the even more powerful magic cannons. No elven knight would be able to withstand such a terrifying magic attack if the energy rays reached up to 100 degrees. With the magic cannons as the core and the archer magic machinery as support, even if the floating ship fell into the heavy encirclement of the Pegasus Knights, it could still use its fierce firepower to tear open a crack and charge out. If the Pegasus Knights dared to force their way through the net of firepower and board the floating ship, what awaited them would be even thicker defensive magic machinery and 3 powerful magic warriors. The situation for the Hippogriphon archers was more or less the same. They picked a few skilled archers from the elven archers and boarded the Hippogriphons that the tribe had painstakingly nurtured. They hovered high in the blue sky and launched long-range attacks against the enemies on the ground. The problem they faced was the same as the Pegasus Knights. They lacked the protection of heavy armor. Naturally, they were always victorious against the human army that didn't have aerial mounts or aerial control. However, against a metal hedgehog made of steel like the floating ship, their weakness was enough to be fatal. First of all, they couldn't fly as high as the floating ship. This made it impossible for them to display their accurate archery and long-range projectile attacks. Secondly, they couldn't get close to the floating ship. With their armor, 2 or 3 metal bullets were enough to incapacitate an excellent hippogriphon archer. If something happened to the hippogriphon, the elven archer that fell from the sky would definitely die. Thirdly, their arrows couldn't do anything to the floating ship's thick shell. According to the goblin engineer's measurements, the outer deck and hull of the floating ship were already half a meter thick. Using bows and arrows to attack a half-meter thick metal plate made of a special alloy made by the Goblin Alchemy Laboratory. Only lunatics and idiots would do such a ridiculous thing. It was because he had such a clear understanding of the enemy and himself that Grimm didn't care about the enemy's aerial mounts. Of course, the elven aerial forces weren't completely useless. The large magical beasts that were specially raised, the chimeras, not only had thick skin and flesh, but they were also proficient in 3 types of magic. If the elves could gather a large number of chimeras and launch an assault, they might be able to break through the floating ship's net of firepower and land successfully. However, that would also be the time for the Magi to show themselves. Every elemental magus was a terrifying elemental volcano. Once they let go of their hands and feet and unleashed a torrent of magus spells without restraint, the terrifying scene would make anyone tremble in fear. In the end, the real threat to the floating ship was a fake air force. The Druid Order. As a special race in the Elven Kingdom, the Druid Order had a transcendent status and powerful strength within the kingdom. Even the most junior Druid had mastered an exquisite secret spell of nature. They could cast spells, transform, and even summon forest companions to fight with them. They were basically the combination of elemental magi, bloodline magi, and summoners. Although they weren't proficient in any of their specialties, they were extremely difficult to deal with when it came to overall combat strength. If there was a troop in the Elven Kingdom that was most likely to pose a huge threat to the floating ship, it would definitely be the Druid Order formed by a large number of druids. They could transform into wind eagles or Socrates eagles and fly into the blue sky to catch up to the floating ship. Once they boarded the floating ship, they could transform into violent earth bears, berserk apes, razor boars, or giant barbarian elephants the moment they landed. This way, they would not be at too much of a disadvantage even if they were to face a defensive magic machine head-on. Moreover, they had the ability to cast spells quickly and could cast binding spells of nature, as well as powerful offensive spells of nature. This was definitely not good news for combat magic machines with weaker magic resistance. Chapter 628. An isolated island in the sea. The interior of the humongous floating ship had a huge living space. As the owners of the ship, the Magi naturally occupied the best and most comfortable part of the place. Inside Mary's residence, a new blood feast was going on cheerfully. In the pool in the middle of the secret room, the rippling blood water was slightly moving up and down. Mary was lying lazily beside the pool. Apart from her delicate and beautiful face, slender and elegant neck, and flawless collarbone that were exposed in the blood water, her entire fair and smooth body was submerged under the bloodlines. The blood water in the pool was also boiling in a strange manner, as if there was a terrifying monster stirring up the seas and rivers, stirring up trouble. Mary stretched out her body contentedly, absorbing the blood energy that was vibrating ceaselessly in the blood water to her heart's content. From time to time, she would stretch out her fair, tender, and somewhat dazzling arm to gently brush away the blood, allowing the dark red, fishy, and sweet blood to turn into droplets of blood and slowly slide down her soul-stirring body. Abundant and pure blood energy washed over her body, causing her to close her eyes and moan from time to time. Her soft moans that seeped into one's bones immediately caused the expressions of the few men in the room to become strange and awkward. The 3 blood knights each sat cross-legged on the ground, each of them holding a beautiful half-dressed elf in their arms. Their strong and large hands roamed around the delicate body of the other party in a tyrannical manner, but their exposed sharp teeth did not hesitate to pierce into the main artery of the other party's neck. The sound of sucking and the unconscious twitching and moaning of the delicate elf intertwined, adding an even more charming and evil atmosphere to the scene of the blood feast. As for that old fox Venlier, he still maintained the appearance of a middle-aged noble, attentively leaning on Mary's ear, as if he was dissecting something. Leading the army alone? You haven't gone mad, have you? Mary suddenly opened her blood-red eyes and glared coldly at Venlier. This is fair and plain, and there are believers of those quacks everywhere. What kind of trouble can we cause with just a few of us? Lady Mary, why have you become so timid after recuperating for a while? The old fox Venlier was not afraid at all. Instead, he tried to persuade her. Have you forgotten how powerful you were in the Plain of Knights? Have you forgotten how fearless you were when you fought against the evil worm in Tech in the Blood Sea? We vampires can't grow by relying on livestock. If we want to become stronger, we have to be unscrupulous and unscrupulous. There seem to be more gods and oracles on this Callan continent. Won't we lose more than we gain if we go out? Mary was also a domineering person. When she heard Venlier mention his past glory, she couldn't help but feel a little moved. What's there to be afraid of? In this room, the five of us are the only ones that matter. As long as we don't lose our lives, everything else is worth it. We can't do that in the Goblin Plain. The blood of the natives there stinks and is not fit to be used as food. The Draconians and Lance are too strong, and it's hard to turn them into blood thralls. In comparison, the elves of Callan Continent are the most suitable food for us vampires. Then if we go out alone, won't we disrupt that guy's later plans? Mary still seemed a little hesitant. What are you worried about, lady? Didn't you see that Lord Grimm came to the south coast to make a scene and lure the elves out of the Central Mountains? If we go on a killing spree, not only will we not disturb Lord Grimm, we'll even take the initiative to share his burden. Lord Grimm will be very happy. Really? Mary's blood-red eyes suddenly brightened. During this period of time, she had always been with Grimm, and their feelings for each other had inexplicably grown. Now that she heard that she could help her partner, her heart immediately became excited. And, Lady Mary, I'll say something that I shouldn't say. The old fox Venlier analyzed meaningfully. This time, the family chose to take the initiative to enter the Fairn Plain to help Lady Alice obtain the Scepter of Prophecy. If we really achieve this goal, Lady Alice might have the chance to become a Grade 2 Witch of Destiny. At that time, you won't have an advantage over Lord Grimm anymore. Mary's blood-red eyes suddenly shrank. If you're willing, Lady Alice, I can't think of a way to kill her in the Central Mountains. No. Mary's voice suddenly turned cold, and she suddenly stood up from the pool of blood. The large bat wings on her back flapped, and she floated up into the air. Not only did the blood not fall into the pool, it instead coiled up and stuck to Mary's curvaceous body, forming a strange blood-red armor. The old fox Venlier was sent flying by the violent power of the blood. He spat out a mouthful of blood in midair and fell 10 steps away, unable to move. Venlier, don't test my patience. Although I don't like that Alice, I know what I can and cannot do. If Alice were to sneak into the Central Mountain Range, Grimm would definitely accompany her. If you plot against Alice, then you'll also plot against Grimm. I think you're tired of living. The blood which was angry, and everyone in the room was shocked. The 3 blood knights threw off the beauties in their arms and knelt on the ground, quietly waiting for their master's orders. The old fox Venlier also struggled to get up, but he did not make any excuses. Instead, he silently prostrated on the ground, resigned to his fate, and waited for his master's decision. Mary's blood-red eyes flashed with anger, and she stared at Venlier. Through the blood shackles and the origin of blood, she could clearly feel that his idea, just now, was completely for her sake and did not have any ill intentions. If not for that, Venlier's life would have been snatched away by the blood shock. As her subordinate blood thralls, the old fox Venlier and the 3 blood knights' lives were completely in Mary's hands. She could kill them with a single thought. After coldly scanning the old fox Venlier several times, and seeing how meek and timid Venlier was, the anger in Mary's heart began to slowly dissipate. Get up. The coldness in Mary's voice gradually dissipated. "Remember, in addition to my orders, you must also swear to obey Grimm's orders. This is my request, and also my order. The blood contract is established immediately. Yes, I will obey your orders." Following the loud response of the blood slaves, a faint blood-colored halo spread out from their bodies. This was obviously the effect of the origin of blood contract. "Very good." Mary nodded in satisfaction. "Go and prepare now. We'll leave in an hour. Our destination, Callan Continent." "Yes." Meanwhile, in another eerie and terrifying secret room on the airship, a huge hive stood tall in the middle of it, covered in viscous blood and surrounded by countless horrifying corpses. To put it bluntly, most of the low-level elves were taken by the insect Lich Blitz to be used as sacrifices for this huge hive, except for a few high-quality ones that were locked up. Unfortunately, this batch of elves was too few and could not satisfy the needs of the new larvae in the hive to continue growing and strengthening themselves. Left with no choice, Bliss could only roll up his sleeves and extend his left arm into the hive, allowing the larvae to devour it. Finally, following the shrill cries of the insects, the larvae hatched. The hive broke open, and new larvae crawled out one after another. There were 21 of them, and they were only the size of a wash basin. Their bodies were flat and slender, and they looked like praying mantises. However, they were obviously many times larger than praying mantises in the natural world, and they were also many times more terrifying. This was a new type of insect that the insect Lich Bliss had researched for a long time, the lacerators. Their appearance was similar to praying mantises, and their fighting style was similar as well. However, compared to praying mantises, their speed and killing ability were much more outstanding. Their bodies were completely black, and the shells on their bodies were deep and dark. There was even a faint metallic luster on them. Behind their backs were two pairs of translucent wings, one big and one small, granting them unparalleled speed. Below their abdomens were 3 pairs of abnormally sharp limbs, allowing them to crawl on the ground at an extremely fast speed. The scariest part was the pair of scythe-like forelimbs on the Ripper's body. There were rows of razor-sharp teeth all over them. When they swung around in the air, they could even create a series of afterimages, and the terrifying sound of the air being torn apart could be heard. The moment these lacerators appeared, they attacked the remaining 7 Centurion scorpions. Both sides engaged in a life-and-death battle in front of the insect Lich Bliss. In the end, the new lacerators had the absolute advantage in numbers. Relying on the strange killing effect of their sharp forelimbs, they successfully surrounded and killed the Centurion scorpions. What followed was a gluttonous feast of fighting. The entire scene was bloody and cruel, but there was a trace of a natural feeling to it. The new insect generals had already been born, but they still needed more flesh and blood to sharpen their claws. The insect Lich Bliss used his remaining right arm to stroke his carapace-shaped chin, finally making up his mind. It was time to explore the Callan Continent. That lord was already a powerful Grade 2 fire shaman, and as a subordinate, not only was Bliss unable to become his right-hand man, but he was also lagging behind. He had even been squeezed out of the first battle team. This reality made Bliss furious and aggrieved, and he felt a great sense of danger. If this continued, he would sooner or later become an insect summoner. This was not in line with his desire to become stronger and improve. Chapter 629. On a giant floating ship, in a secret cabin, Grimm and Alice sat opposite each other. There was only a wooden statue the size of a palm on the simple wooden table. At this moment, red ropes were entwined around the wooden statue in a strange way. The red string looked very ordinary, as if it was just an ordinary object. However, it was overflowing with a strange wave of sorcery, completely sealing the mysterious aura within the wooden statue of the deity. This seemed to be some kind of strange sealing technique. It was only because it was made of such ordinary red ropes that Grimm felt that it was strange and unfathomable. What's so strange about that? Alice seemed to have noticed Grimm's surprise. She pursed her lips and said with a malicious smile, "The materials used by ancient wizards to cast spells were always junk, stones, mud, bones, plant sap, and the like. The spells that they casually cast can use the power of laws to pry open the laws of the plane. They don't need to rely on powerful spell ingredients like the rookie magi of today to enhance the effects of their spells." Ugh, Grimm was speechless. "Why do I feel like I'm one of the rookie wizards you're talking about? You're much better than them," Alice said with a faint smile. "Back then, if I hadn't been knocked unconscious by your strange spell, I wouldn't have been so unlucky to fall into your hands." After saying this, her eyebrows were full of sorrow. Grimm rolled his eyes and said in a muffled voice, "Didn't you ask me to investigate the mysteries of this statue today? Why are you talking about the past for no reason?" To be honest, the process of him defeating Alice back then was not that glorious. There was no lack of tragic memories of him being chased by Alice. Therefore, Grimm felt an itch all over his body when he thought about it. He wanted to directly erase it from his memory. Although Alice had been through a lot of hardships and pressure, she had become a lot more mature and experienced. But the sly and mischievous taste in her bones was still there. She could not help but want to settle old scores with Grimm whenever she had the chance. Seeing Grimm's helpless expression, Alice finally let him go and warned him sternly, "I'll unseal this statue later. If I make any mistakes, I might alert the legendary god of moonlight." Hearing this, even Grimm's expression turned solemn. The word god was a huge taboo for wizards. There were no gods in the sorcerer world, and no gods were allowed to appear. What magi worshipped was knowledge, ability, and a calm and wise mind. Once a believer knelt before a god, it meant that he had voluntarily handed over control of his consciousness. From now on, all of his actions, all of his thoughts, had to be measured by the will of the gods. And he himself had become a continuation of the will of the god, a carrier, or to put it simply, a puppet. Sorcerers are not suited for faith. If there was a need, it could only be knowledge. Once they lost their foothold, they would lose the meaning and independence of their existence. Therefore, in the sorcerer world, there had always been a clear distinction between individual worship and faith. Once a wizard crossed this boundary, he would immediately become the public enemy of the entire sorcerer community. However, rejecting faith was one thing. Many sorcerers were curious about the power of faith, which was a completely different kind of mysterious power. They had conducted in-depth and extensive research on it, and had a preliminary understanding of its power attributes and characteristics. First of all, the formation of faith relied on strong psychological suggestions. The gods would find ways to root the core rules of their divine domain into the minds of their believers, and through specific actions, speech, or rituals, the believers would repeatedly strengthen the psychological suggestions, thus forming a psychological dependence. This would cause the believers to regard the core rules of the gods as a supreme goal to achieve the meaning of their lives. And in this process of spiritual interaction, the pure and persistent soul consciousness would stimulate a strange spiritual power, thus forming the power of faith. Therefore, from the analysis of the origin of magic, the power of faith should belong to the category of extraordinary psychic powers. If one looked at the problem from the narrow perspective of the psychic, it seemed that the evil mind flayer and the infamous brain eater of the multiverse were the same brothers of the same sect. The only difference was that one of them was completely naked, devouring the brains of other living beings without any concealment to replenish its own power. The other just made the process very long, treating the believers as their own flock and source of power. They beautified the process of devouring infinitely, making it seem very grand. But what was the difference between the two when one cut open the hypocritical surface? And what made the wizards most despise the gods was the attitude and way they treated their believers. Various studies had fully demonstrated that only the ignorant and weak intelligent races were the best source of the power of faith. Therefore, in order to maintain the purity of the believers, the kingdoms and territories controlled by the gods rejected the development of technology and civilization. For thousands of years, the gods had made full use of the contradictions and conflicts of interest between kings and nobles, between nobles and nobles, and between nobles and commoners to create all kinds of social unrest and armed conflicts. And living beings who had always lived in such conflicts and hardships would entrust everything to the illusory piety of faith. Therefore, the massive and endless power of faith became the source of strength for the gods to continue to grow. But in this way, whether it was the gods at the top of the food chain or the farmers at the bottom, there were two grasshoppers tied to this chain of faith. It was just that one was powerful and the other was weak. Unfortunately, no matter how great the disparity in strength was, they had all become parasites of the laws of the plane. The gods collected the power of faith and used part of the laws of the plane they controlled to transform this power of faith into more condensed divine power, thus becoming powerful shepherds who stood proudly at the peak of the plane. The plane was their pasture, the believers of wisdom were their cattle and sheep, and the statue on the wooden table before them was a tool for the ignorant cattle and sheep to communicate with their master. As for Grimm and Alice, they might be powerful figures in front of the cattle and sheep, but in the eyes of the gods, they were just two slightly stronger cattle and sheep or ants. Therefore, they had to be very careful with any actions against the gods. According to some books on witchcraft, when the name or divine title of a powerful god was mentioned in the plane, it would unknowingly trigger the laws of the plane, causing the god to have a vague feeling. If the god also had the divine title of prophecy, they could even use this vague feeling to calculate the cause and effect of the whole thing, as well as the countless possibilities in the future. Fortunately, the goddess of moonlight Mivi they were dealing with this time was not bad at prophecy. Otherwise, Alice would not have dared to try to analyze the statue that contained the aura of her faith in the plane of Farron. Seeing how eager Alice was, Grimm scratched his head and said, "What do you want me to do by calling me here? I don't know anything about the power of faith, so I'm afraid I can't help you much." Alice smiled. "I didn't call you here for you to do anything. I just want you to sit at the side and watch me do it quietly. And then, you're the calmest and most intelligent magus I've ever met. You can make your own judgment, and if there's anything wrong with the unsealing ceremony or the investigation process, immediately destroy this statue without hesitation." "I'm worried. I won't be able to destroy this statue by then." Grimm nodded in understanding. It turned out that Alice had called him over to act as a supervisor. If Alice's actions were to offend the goddess of moonlight, she would naturally have the means to strangle a small fry like her to death. At that time, it would be time for Grimm to save her life. Of course, this was just a magus's instinct to be cautious. The goddess of moonlight was such a high and mighty god. If there was no special reason or provocation, it would be very difficult to attract her attention. Therefore, when Alice said those words to Grimm, the two of them didn't really think that such a thing would happen. They were still very relaxed. Seeing Alice's slender white fingers lightly touch the red string on the statue and untie it in a certain order, Grimm smiled and communicated with the I chip in his mind. I chip. Observe and record Alice's every move. If there's anything wrong, immediately take measures to intervene. Beep. Command received. Recording in progress. Following the nimble movements of Alice's slender fingers, the red string sealing the wooden statue was finally completely untied. With a flick of his finger, a strange, gentle, and serene power spread out from the statue. This simple and crude statue, which was originally carved from ordinary oak, strangely came to life. The originally crude face of the statue, which only had simple eyes and nose, began to stretch and change. The grain of the wood became smooth and clean, and the slightly protruding nose suddenly became straight and elegant. What was even more frightening was that the eyelashes of the closed eyes of the statue began to flicker, as if they were about to open at any moment. Beep detected the appearance of a mysterious force originating from within a divine item. Detected the appearance of a small-scale spatial collapse. Mysterious spatial passageway is forming A series of red alarms sounded in Grimm's mind. He looked around and immediately saw Alice staring at the wooden statue in a daze, as if she did not sense the approaching danger. Spatial passageway? What was that damned goddess of moonlight trying to send over? Even if it was only a small-scale spatial collapse, the force transmitted was not something that Grimm and Alice could withstand. Hence, Grimm did not hesitate to raise his right hand and fiercely punch the wooden statue. The violent and ferocious force of flames exploded, and the wooden statue that only had half its eyes opened was instantly torn into pieces. The strange force also disappeared at the same time. Chapter 630. Grimm and Alice looked at each other in dismay. Wiping the blood from the corner of their mouths, the two of them calmed themselves down and finally recovered from the strange shock just now. Alice moved closer to Grimm and examined the shadow of the crescent moon on his forehead. She even wiped it with her hand. It was very strange. She did not touch anything at all, as if it was just an illusion cast by the moon in the sky. However, when she scanned it with her spiritual force, she could feel the existence of the crescent moon. Furthermore, as the moon waxed and waned in the sky, the shadow seemed to evolve as well. Grimm used the AI chip to scan the shadow on their foreheads, and he could faintly feel a spatial fluctuation. "What is this?" Grimm asked in a low voice. "I'm not too sure, but it seems like some kind of divine spell." Alice answered hesitantly. "Divine spell, Mark? What's it used for?" "If I'm not wrong, it should be used to activate a spatial mark. However, it's a spatial spell driven by divine spells, so I can't get rid of it with my current spells." "Spatial mark?" Grimm could not help but mutter to himself. If the enemy had their spatial mark, wouldn't they be able to accurately locate them? If Grimm and Alice got close to the Callan continent again, they would probably be locked on by the god of moonlight. "Don't worry, this divine spell is not complete. As long as we don't bathe in the moonlight, this divine rune will not be able to obtain enough power to send our spatial mark to the outside world." F***CK. Grimm was about to go on a killing spree, but he had been entangled by this strange divine moon shadow rune. How could he not feel depressed? "Can you get rid of it?" Grimm tried a few times, but he could not touch the shadow. It was as if it did not exist, and he could only ask Alice in frustration. "This divine rune is formed by the divine force of the god of moonlight, and it is very different from our wizard force. Without enough time to study it, it will be difficult to come up with a better way to remove it." This time, Grimm was completely depressed. Could he not show up in the following battles? One had to know that the airship was so large that even if it could hide in the clouds during the day, it would still tear through the clouds and form a clear cloud path when traveling at high speed. Therefore, if he wanted to carry out some sneak attacks without the elves noticing, it was undoubtedly more suitable to do so at night. Now that Grimm was entangled by the crescent moon shadow talisman, if he showed himself at night, the divine moon shadow talisman would create spatial ripples. By then, it would definitely attract the attention of the god of moonlight. After all, Grimm had killed the elven believers of the moonlight god. If Grimm could pinpoint the location of the invaders, a large number of elven experts would take advantage of the situation to attack. Based on Grimm's understanding, the moonlight goddess had a Tier 3 elven oracle under her command. If this fellow were to block the airship, even Grimm wasn't confident in escaping unscathed. An elven oracle who could temporarily borrow the divine power of a god, even if he was only at grade 3, was still a person worthy of respect. Just the thought of using his family's wizards to fight against an oracle gave Grimm a headache. Grimm rubbed his chin with a gloomy expression and frowned deeply. He couldn't make up his mind. Alice, who was watching from the side, couldn't help but poke him. "Feeling sorry for your subordinates? Since you don't want to fight the enemy, why don't you go find our allies?" "Allies?" Grimm was stunned at first, then his eyes lit up. "The allied forces of the Dark Witches and the Pale Witches?" He then chuckled. "You're really bad." Alice rolled her eyes at him. "Hurry up and find someone to make 2 headbands to temporarily cover the Divine Moon Shadow Talisman. I'll contact the Dark Witches right now." Grimm smiled and left. Callan Continent, Central Mountain Range. In the midst of an undulating sea of trees, towering and majestic divine nature temples towered majestically. None of the temples used any bricks or stones. Instead, they used divine power to grow tall, ancient trees, twisting and twisting their lush branches to form the basic outline of the temples. Dark green vines and beautiful rose branches covered every corner of the temple, decorating it into the most beautiful fairyland on earth. These temples didn't all belong to the great elven goddess Sylvia. There were also the sacred temples of several other elven gods, including the goddess of moonlight Mivi. Since these Logia elven gods were able to build their temples together, it meant that the relationship between them was natural and harmonious, advancing and retreating as one. The sea god system and the human god system both had far more gods than the elven god system, but in terms of unity and cohesion, they were far less close than the elven god system. Therefore, this was the main reason why the other two god systems didn't dare to provoke the elven god system. In an area on the periphery of the huge temple complex, there stood a quiet and deep sacred temple. Unlike other divine temples, where believers constantly came and went, high-ranking priests shuttled between believers, reciting poems and prayers praising the elven gods. This divine temple of nature was unusually quiet. In this huge temple, except for a few priests who gathered in the main temple and quietly discussed something, it was rare to see a large number of believers coming here to pray and offer gifts to the elven gods. Inside the main temple, Cinia, a tier 3 elven oracle with the title Moon Shadow Messenger, was kneeling in front of a tall statue, praying silently. Beside her were the chief priest of the temple, Aurora, and 2 priestesses. They closed their eyes and seemed to be listening to the oracle of their god. Even though it was daytime, the main temple was shrouded in a layer of dark, hazy moonlight. Any outsider or god would not be able to see the secrets within unless they stepped into the vicinity of the temple. If any non-believers of the god of moonlight stepped within half a mile of the temple, they would definitely trigger the divine barrier that Goddess Miwei had set up. At that time, Goddess Miwei's consciousness would be transmitted from the distant divine realm, and she would be able to determine if the intruder was a friend or foe. After half a day of prayer and communication, the tier 3 elven oracle, Cinia, finally stood up, and the light of faith that gathered around the tall, majestic, graceful statue that was shrouded in the hazy moonlight began to slowly dissipate. Soon, the statue that was filled with a strong, holy aura turned back into a huge, flawless wooden statue. Although the woman in the statue was still as beautiful as a painting, and her demeanor was dignified and elegant, she no longer had the holy feeling that made people want to kneel and worship her. Now that you've heard the goddess oracle, let's talk. How can we complete the mission that the goddess has given us? Although they were both servants of the god, this tier 3 oracle, Cinia, had a much higher status than the chief priest of the temple, so the conversation was centered around her. Cinia was a tall, beautiful female elf. She wore an exquisite set of elven armor that was decorated with beautiful patterns that looked like rose branches and green vines. Moon Shadow Envoy was not only her title, but also her advanced profession. This was a special class that was between a magic knight and a spellcaster, and it also had some of the attacking methods of a shadow assassin. Therefore, in terms of combat strength, it was a terrifying divine spell user who was strong in one-on-one battles, but weak in group battles. Evil is growing in the distance. The goddess has warned us that those evil witches have once again invaded our homeland. In particular, a group of despicable people killed the believers of the Moonlight Shrine and destroyed a nature altar that the goddess had set up herself. This kind of evil must be punished. I will gather the believers of the Moonlight Shrine and give them a fierce counterattack. Although Aurora's words were filled with anger, her tone and expression were calm. This was a typical characteristic of all the elven believers of the Moonlight Goddess. Elegance, nobility, calmness. These were the core beliefs that the Moonlight Goddess admired and respected the most. Therefore, as a believer of the goddess, even if Aurora was extremely angry, she still looked calm and collected on the surface. The other two priests, including the Tier 3 Elven Oracle, naturally did the same. This doesn't seem to be enough. Cinia added confidently, the goddess has used her divine power to leave a moon shadow mark on them. As long as they are bathed in the moonlight, I will be able to clearly sense their location. Therefore, I need you to gather some experts who are good at fighting. Once the enemy reveals their location, I will use my divine power to teleport the entire team over in an instant. Understood, Lady Cinia. Aurora nodded slightly. I will gather all the people you need in the shortest time possible. This great revenge will not be delayed. The two oracles bowed their heads in acknowledgement and slowly retreated from the divine temple. Half an hour later, a strong natural magic aura filled the side shrine. Urgent magic messages were quickly transmitted in all directions with the help of the divine power network set up by the Elven Kingdom. In an instant, in the vast magic forest of the Kalan continent, the high-level believers of the Moonlight Goddess left their homes and gathered at the main shrine in the central mountain range. As the magic forest was too vast, it would take a long time for the believers from the outlying areas to reach the main shrine. Therefore, the temporary revenge team was made up of pure elven believers near the central mountain range. Among them, there were no less than a dozen high-level professionals, Tier 2, and 1 or 200 elite professionals, Tier 1. Chapter 631. On the south coast of the Kalan continent, the Echo Islands. This was a huge group of reef islands adjacent to the coastline. Due to the action of the tides, this group of reef islands would sink below sea level for most of the year. Only in September and October, when the storm season was approaching, would the reef islands emerge, becoming a forbidden area that no navigator dared to set foot on. Therefore, the Echo Islands were used by the Pale Witches to build a stable forward base for their continuous invasion of the Kalan continent. The elves knew the danger that the Echo Islands posed to them, but they were helpless. This was the only main island in the Echo archipelago that was exposed to the sea surface all year round. The witches had set up a large number of defensive and offensive spell formations. In addition, there was a Grade 3 advanced witch overseeing it. If the elves wanted to remove it, they would have to pay an unimaginable price. Moreover, the Echo Islands were still 60 to 70 miles away from the Kalan continent. If the elves wanted to attack the main island, they would have to send a huge navy and air cavalry. Once the Elven Navy was sent out, the crisscrossed reef groups around the Echo Islands would become a nightmare for them in battle. As for the Elven Air Cavalry, if they set off from the south coast and flew 60 to 70 miles to besiege the stronghold of the witches, most of the Pegasi and Hippogriffs would not be able to sustain it. Therefore, the Echo Islands had existed for 100 or 200 years, but the elves had never uprooted it. The only thing the elves could do was to build a new elven city, Greenwater City, near the coastline closest to the Echo Islands. They stationed a powerful elven army there, the Windrunners, to resist the invasion of the witches. This Windstalker army seemed to include all of the aerial units of the Elven Kingdom that could fly, from low-level flower fairies to high-level green fairies, from low-level Pegasus Knights to high-level Silver Pegasus Knights, as well as groups of Hippogriffs, Chimera Demon Beasts, Windhawk raiding teams. As long as it was a flying magical beast that could be found in the Kalan continent, they could be seen in Greenwater City. Coupled with a large number of low-level druids and their summoned jungle companions, if the witches dared to invade Greenwater City, they would have to face an overwhelming number of flying magical beasts. With Greenwater City and the large Windrunner army restraining them, the invasion of the witches in the south coast seemed to be all bark and no bite, appearing a little weak. After the allied forces of the Dark Witches and the Pale Witches crossed the ocean and entered the Echo Islands, they could only send some witch squads to bypass the Greenwater City and make some small trouble. Due to the existence of the Windrunner troops, as well as the elven villages around the coastline that had already moved inward, the witches' harvest wasn't that great, and they even had to endure tremendous danger to their lives. This invisibly lowered the witches' profits from the war, thus causing serious dissatisfaction among the Dark Witches who had crossed the border. This was especially true for the Tier 3 Dark Witch, Ursa, who had led the team to the Ashen Witches. This time, Ulthar led the team here, shouldering the heavy responsibility of the leader of the witches. In addition to bringing back a small group of elves for the Dark Witches, he also had to find a way to obtain the supreme treasure of the Pegasus family, the water of Magic Spring. The expansion of the Dark Witches in the Shadow Plane was going smoothly, and they urgently needed to migrate a group of high-grade intelligent life that could reproduce on their own. After choosing, they found that the Fane Forest elves provided by the Ashen Witches were the most suitable. However, the elves that the Ashen Witches regularly captured from the Fane Plain were either elven warriors or elven archers. Almost all of them were physically strong and suitable for training as war slaves. This was a bit inconsistent with the expectations of the Dark Witches. What the Dark Witches wanted was a whole group of elves that included the elderly, children, women, and children. The number of elves should be at least 400. This way, it would be convenient for the witches to observe and test the infection process of the Shadow Plane against foreign intelligent life groups. As for the Pegasus Magic Spring, it was the key to the continuous production of magical beasts in the magic forest of the Callan continent. It was said that a pregnant Pegasus or silver Pegasus could only give birth to a real magical beast Pegasus after returning to their holy land, the Magic Spring, and using the water from the Magic Spring. Otherwise, they would only give birth to ordinary wild horses. This strange phenomenon, of course, also aroused the curiosity of the witches. Recently, the Dark Witches were planning to cultivate a group of suitable flying wizard beasts, so they were eager to get some of the water of Magic Spring for research. However, the Pegasus Magic Spring was far away in the depths of the Central Mountain Range, which was also heavily guarded by the elves. So although the Dark Witches were anxious, they did not dare to act rashly. They could only think of ways to slowly obtain it. Therefore, the Dark Witch Ursa could not bear the fact that the Ashen Witches occupied the periphery of the Callan continent and did not make any big movements. She wanted to part ways with them as soon as possible. However, at this time, she unexpectedly received a battle invitation that made her heart beat faster. The battle invitation came from Alice. Since the outbreak of the witch disaster, the Destiny Witch leader Alice, relying on her powerful floating ship, left the Ashen Witches' fleet and broke into the Callan continent alone. The Branch Witches had long been envious of this huge metal fortress that could advance and retreat freely. However, if such a huge floating ship wanted to fly in the air for a long time and fight in enemy-occupied areas, the number of magic crystals consumed at every moment was shocking. Therefore, it was not that the Branch Witches did not have such means, but they were really unable to support such a terrifying consumption of magic crystals. As for the Destiny Witches, the Tower of Destiny had closed itself for thousands of years, so the number of magic crystals they had accumulated must be astonishing. Therefore, they could extravagantly consume magic crystals in a short period of time to make up for their shortcomings in combat power. Although the other witches were envious of this, they were not surprised. The Destiny Witches led by Alice had been breaking into the Callan continent for half a month, so they must have gained something. However, with their current team, they did not even have a level 3 which to hold the line. They must have been badly hit by the strong counterattack of the elves. Now that Alice had taken the initiative to invite the Dark Witches to act with them, it seemed that they had suffered a lot. With a hint of sneer and contempt, the Dark Witch Ursa did not hesitate to accept Alice's battle invitation. Fane Calendar 10471, October 12th. 2 light elven warships patrolled the periphery of the Echo Islands. Compared to the large human ships, the elven warships were slightly smaller. The hull was long and narrow, and the upper deck was relatively flat. On it, there were many long-range magic equipment unique to the elves, bird-winged ballistae. Such elven warships were obviously not suitable for the stormy, deep-sea areas, so they could not set sail for long distances. However, in the coastal areas near the coastline, due to the ship's advantages such as high speed and flexibility, they became the most common combat ships in the Elven Navy. It was a sunny afternoon. The sky was blue, and the sea breeze was gentle. Two elven warships were patrolling the periphery of the reef island, enjoying the beautiful and pleasant sea view while monitoring every move of the witches on the Echo Islands not far away. From time to time, some winged Pegasi flew up from their ships, carrying elven knights equipped with monocular, silently monitoring the surroundings from high altitude. The snow-white horses, wide white wings, and the elegant posture of walking in the air as if they were walking on flat ground made this group of Pegasi knights attract everyone's attention. There were elven warriors on both sides of the elven warships waving at the Pegasi knights, greeting them loudly. Although these magical Pegasi were handsome, their stamina was far inferior to other flying magical beasts, so they were usually only responsible for monitoring the airspace within 3 to 5 miles of the elven warships. Guarding the airspace further away was often the responsibility of the hippogriffs with their endurance. Today's sea conditions were so good, and the scenery between the blue sea and blue sky was boundless. Therefore, the Pegasi knights who were on guard in the air suddenly played the old trick of diving and treading on the waves around the elven warships. Vigorous Pegasi carrying the elven knights swooped down from an altitude of 200 to 300 meters, and the moment they neared the surface of the sea, they suddenly pulled up horizontally. The Pegasi's forehooves stepped on the rolling waves, treading on the undulating waves. This soul-stirring scene immediately caused waves of cheers from the elves. Even the tall fortresses of the Echo Islands in the distance had many black dots drilling out, peeking at them from afar. Sedaris wiped away the splashing sea foam on his face, and once again flew higher amidst the cheers and waving of the elves. The silver Pegasi under him kept climbing with all its might, and finally arrived at the side of Knight Higas, who was soaring hundreds of meters in the air. "Don't you want to go down and play for a while? It's rare to come to the Echo Islands, and the witches don't dare to come out easily. It's a good opportunity for our old buddy to relax. I've been cooped up in the cabin all this time, and my bones are about to rust," Sedaris asked briskly, his eyes filled with deep confusion. Most of the elven aerial cavalry had been transferred to Greenwater City, and even a few powerful elven oracles were stationed there. The witch disaster that broke out this year had been strangled by the elves at its source. So far, the attacking large group of witches had not even had the chance to set foot on the elves' homeland. As for the scattered teams of witches who had sneaked into the Callan continent at night, as long as they dared to show themselves, they would definitely not be able to escape the pursuit of the elven windrunners and elven powerhouses. Therefore, psychologically speaking, Sedaris did not take the group of witches in front of him seriously. It was said that this year, the focus of the witches' attack was once again on the Fane continent, which was dominated by humans. The Callan continent was just a bluff. Therefore, as long as they survived the 4-month low tide period, when the violent monsoon blew in the depths of the sea, the witches would have to obediently return to the evil Shadow Island again. At that time, the Echo Islands would also be swallowed by the surging sea, and once again sink under the sea. Without this powerful outpost, it would not be so easy for the witches to invade the Callan continent again. Just as Sedaris was harassing Higas, the somewhat stubborn and eccentric silver Pegasus suddenly shook his body. He pulled out a shiny silver telescope from his waist, held it in front of his eyes, and looked into the distance on the other side of the sea. "Warning! Warning! Enemy attack!" Chapter 632. At the end of the distant horizon, 3 hippogriffs were fleeing with all their might. They flew up and down, tumbling and making all sorts of dodging movements. Meanwhile, the elven archers on their backs were futilely drawing their bows and firing arrows at a massive metal warship that was chasing after them. Unfortunately, the metal warship was flying high above the clouds. The arrows of the elven archers had only flown halfway before they were swept to the side by the strong wind outside the warship. The bottom of the metal warship opened up, revealing pitch-black cannon muzzles. 20 to 30 bull-sized purple energy rays were fired at once. This level of energy rays could overturn the airspace within a radius of nearly 100 meters each time, and any aerial steed within it would not be able to evade such a dense energy beam with their bodies. Hence, under the horrified gazes of Haegis and Sidurus, two of the three hippogriffs did not manage to escape in time and were shot full of holes amidst their shrill cries. Their flesh and blood exploded into a bloody mist that filled the air. The elven archers on their backs did not manage to escape and were destroyed along with them. "It's that metal devil," Sidurus roared, pulling out the elven warblade at his waist with a whoosh. "Sidurus, don't be rash. Inform the warship to evacuate as soon as possible. I'll hold him back." Haegis ordered his companion as quickly as possible. He patted the silver Pegasus beneath him, and the silver Pegasus that had been with him for more than 10 years immediately flapped its wings, its four hooves flying as it tried its best to climb above the metal warship. The terrifying cannons could be seen on both sides of the metal warship and at the bottom of the warship. It was a fool's dream to charge onto the deck under the bombardment of the cannons. That was why Haegis had given up on the opportunity to attack the other party directly from the start, and instead chose to climb higher in an attempt to find a suitable breakthrough point from the blind spots of the other party. However, the metal warship was flying at an astonishing height, almost sticking close to the clouds as it flew. Wherever it went, the towering metal hull crushed the white clouds one after another, leaving behind an intermittent cloud path. If Haegis wanted to find a breakthrough point from above, he would have to fly higher than the other party. For a silver Pegasus that was active in the illusory forest all year round and only needed to cruise at an altitude of 100 to 200 meters for a long time, the difficulty was simply too great. But at this point, no one cared about this. Even Haegis was cheering the silver Pegasus on as he quickly threw the javelins and arrows on its back into the air. To lighten the silver Pegasus load, Haegis even removed the metal armor, allowing it to slide off his body. A part of the javelins of the 3 bags of arrows used for long-range attacks, Haegis had even thrown away 2 of them. The remaining bag still had 30 arrows, enough for him to attack to his heart's content after he boarded the metal warship. As the silver Pegasus continued to climb, their height gradually reached the same level as the metal warship. They could already clearly see the tall figures moving around on the warship's deck. Damn it, the deck was filled with terrifying metal puppets. Their tall and mighty bodies shone with a dazzling metallic luster under the illumination of the blazing sun. Moreover, the other party seemed to have noticed his actions. On the side of the ship near him, the metal puppets raised their metal arms horizontally, and terrifying black muzzles protruded from them. What are they preparing to do? Are they preparing to launch a long-range attack? Don't most of the metal puppets only have close-range combat ability? A series of strange thoughts rose from the bottom of Haegis' heart. But before he could find the answer, the rows of metal puppets suddenly shot out a series of small black dots from their horizontally extended muzzles, attacking Haegis and the silver Pegasus like a storm. As a high-grade elven warrior, Haegis naturally had an enviable keen vision. Although the black dots were small and dense, Haegis could still see the truth of the black dots with his superhuman dynamic vision. They were metal pellets the size of a fingernail. Under the stimulation of a powerful magical energy, they lined up in a row and shot towards him in an unstoppable manner. A strong intuition of death struck Haegis' heart in an instant. He suddenly flipped backward, his entire body flipping off the horse's back. As he fell rapidly, he waved the saber in his hand rapidly. The silver Pegasus, which was still struggling to climb into the sky a moment ago, was riddled with sieves by the dense pellets in the next moment. The blood that sprayed out immediately formed a bloody rain on the spot. Most of the pellets were blocked by the larger silver Pegasus, and more than half of the remaining pellets were blocked by Haegis' flying saber. But there were still many pellets that passed through the surging saber light and drilled into his body. Haegis' vigorous body shook violently in the air, and he was sent flying by the metal pellets. A large amount of blood mixed with torn flesh burst into a bloody mist in the air. The metal pellets might not be large, but the kinetic energy they contained was abnormally large. If a pellet the size of a fingernail were to hit an ordinary person, it would directly pass through the body and leave a huge wound the size of a bowl on the body where it was shot. And Haegis was worthy of being an elite elven knight. His physique and strength were far above that of an ordinary person, so his ability to resist attacks was also 100 times stronger than an ordinary person. Of the 4 pellets, one had pierced through his left shoulder, leaving a huge wound there. One had pierced through his right leg, almost bursting off half of his calf's flesh. One had brushed past his left abdomen, leaving a deep blood stain. One had embedded itself into the lower part of his right chest, and most of the surrounding bones had already been broken and shattered with such a huge injury. An ordinary person would have long since died. But Haegis was still alive and falling rapidly from the sky. With his injuries and his current height, even if it was seawater below him, he would still be killed by the terrifying impact the moment he fell into the water. A soft sound rang out. The familiar sound of horse hooves suddenly rang in his ears. Then his body tightened. Haegis had already been caught by Cadaris, who had rushed over on his horse, successfully avoiding the disaster of falling to his death. Holding his partner, who had already turned into a bloody person with one hand, Sidaris' eyes were filled with tears as he urged the silver Pegasus to move left and right with all his might, narrowly dodging the dozen or so rays that were shot down from the metal warship. The metal warship high in the sky did not seem to care about the 2 silver Pegasus knights at all. Seeing that they had not been killed after 2 rounds, it did not change course to continue chasing. Instead, the bow of the ship slightly changed direction, slowly pressing down on the 2 elven warships in the distance. At this time, the elven warship was already in chaos. Under the loud shout of the elven commander, the warship turned around with difficulty, desperately fleeing in the direction of the Callan continent in the distance. On top of the warship, there was a dense group of flying creatures that were rushing in the direction of the metal warship. It was the over 200 flower fairies that had gone out with the warship. Although they were not large, there were quite a few of them, and their claws were also covered in plant poison. Moreover, their flying speed was very fast, so they were very qualified to be the close-range flying force of the elven warship. But it was a pity that their wings were too weak. They had more than enough speed, but not enough power. Therefore, when they soared to a height of around 100 meters, they began to feel a bit tired. Therefore, with a burst of concentrated fire from the metal warship in the sky, the aggressive group of flower fairies was immediately cut down by half. The remaining ones let out strange, squeaking sounds before quickly scattering like birds and beasts. Those flower fairies that turned around and wanted to return to the elven warship were quickly caught up by the giant warship in the sky and then destroyed. Only those flower fairies that were a bit more vigilant turned around and flew towards the vast sea, dodging the next round of concentrated fire. After all, those floating on the sea could not outrun those flying in the sky. After a quarter of an hour, the giant floating warship caught up to the 2 elven warships. After 3 rounds of concentrated fire, the 2 elven warships also sank to the bottom of the sea. At this time, there were large amounts of ship wreckage and countless struggling elven warriors floating on the sea. The giant floating warship did not seem to care about these weak elves at all. The giant warship adjusted once again, letting go of the attacks on the fallen elves and flying towards the Echo Islands. There, in front of the fortress on the main island of the Echo Islands, the dark witches and pale witches drilled out of their strongholds and watched the massacre taking place on the sea from afar. If we don't consider the consumption of magic crystals, this kind of metal fortress that can fly in the sky is indeed a powerful existence that all secondary planes can't match. The Grade 3 Dark Witch Uxer could not help but nod in praise. Although Alice only had Grade 1 strength, if she could contribute this giant floating warship, she would barely have the strength to cooperate with a Grade 3 witch like her. This made Ulthar, who had some doubts about this cooperation, immediately smile from ear to ear. Although the Destiny Witches had a lot of magic crystals and were even more extravagant in using the giant floating warship, in the end, they did not have anyone that could be used to hold the fort. Therefore, in this cooperation, he might even be able to take the lead in the operation and make Alice obedient to him. The grade 3 Pale, which in charge of guarding this place, did not directly show herself. Instead, she hid in the sturdy fortress and used her mental strength to silently investigate this strange giant floating warship. When she first saw it, even she could not help but think that it was an airship that could only be used as a means of transportation in the Silver Alliance. However, when her mental strength slowly extended to the giant warship, it was immediately blocked by the strange energy field outside the warship. An energy field? The grade 3 Pale, which became bewildered once again. Could it be that those Destiny Witches were already extravagant enough to add an energy field to such a huge warship? How many magic crystals did this cost them? These Destiny Witches that could not be guessed. Chapter 633. A small welcoming banquet was held in the huge reception hall of the floating ship. As the host, the number and quality of the witches on the Destiny Witches side was not much inferior to the other side. Among the 11 Dark Witches, there was 1 grade 3, 1 grade 2, and 9 grade 1 witches. On the Destiny Witches side, there were also grade 2 witches present at the banquet, including Grim and Zachary. As for the grade 1 witches, there were also quite a number of them. Overall, apart from the fact that the Destiny Witches were slightly inferior in terms of high-grade witches, they were even stronger than the Dark Witches in terms of overall strength. Of course, the main reason for such an interesting situation was that the Dark Witches who came to Farron were only a part of their faction, while the Destiny Witches had already done their best. Almost all the Northern Witches knew about the relationship between the young Grade 2 Fire Witches and Alice. It was only because both sides kept a low profile, one in the central part of the continent and the other in the extreme north, that there were no strange rumors spreading. But during this trip to Fane, these two powers, one central and one northern, had clearly begun to join forces. This had already caused the dissatisfaction of some of the Northern Witches' leaders. Of course, these were things that the higher-ups had to consider, but it did not prevent the Dark Witches and the Destiny Witches from cooperating perfectly in this world. However, the Northern Witches had always been arrogant and domineering. So even though Grim was a Grade 2 Fire Witch, they still did not pay much attention to him. The Grade 2 Dark Witch would rather talk to Chef than speak to Grim. Grim could not help but shake his head and sigh at this arrogance. At the same time, the guilt of deceiving and using Grim disappeared. After the floating ship received the group of Dark Witches from the Echo Islands, it did not stop at all and turned back. While the witches were drinking and chatting in the reception hall, the three leaders of their respective factions met in another secret room to discuss. Ulthar, Alice, and Grim. However, Ulthar was obviously dissatisfied with Grim's appearance. The first thing he said was a pun, "You're really strong." After that, he teased Alice, "You're really good at picking people." For a moment, Alice and Grim's expressions turned a little ugly. Ulthar was a middle-aged witch dressed in a black robe. Her face was cold and gloomy. She had a hooked nose and thick, purplish-black lips. She looked crazy and a little neurotic. However, the dark aura around him was unforgettable. With Ulthar's strength as a Tier 3 witch, she naturally had nothing to fear in front of the two of them. Hence, the two of them could only force a smile as they listened to Ulthar's crazy words. They did not have the strength to fall out with her. Ulthar didn't seem to care at all, but it was obvious that he had placed Grim as Alice's gigolo. They were trying to force Grim out of the room before the negotiation even started. Fortunately, Grim and Alice had a tacit understanding, so Grim simply kept his mouth shut and sat quietly to the side, allowing Alice and Ulthar to confront each other. Although Alice was only a Tier 1 witch, she had the strange magic aura of the leader of the witches. Hence, even if Ulthar's rank was much higher than Alice's, she did not dare to bully her too much. At the very least, when the two of them sat down, Ulthar had to wait for Alice to sit down before slowly sitting down. The negotiation between the two was frank and efficient. As Northern witches, both sides were very clear about how to fight against foreign enemies. Being united against a common enemy was the best way to cooperate. Both sides had traversed the distant plane of space, from the Magus world to this fair plane. Wasn't it for the sake of plundering enough plane resources to support the further development of their families? Hence, the only thing between them was the elves of the Callan continent. Only by moving this mountain would they be able to usurp the most generous reward. However, based on the current information, it was impossible for the group of witches in front of them to defeat the strong elves. In the past, the Pale, which had almost used all her strength but still failed to do so. It was even more impossible for them to do so with their current strength. Moreover, even if they could do it, the Pale, which would be the one to benefit the most from defeating the elves in vain. At most, the allied army would get some leftovers. Therefore, both sides had no interest in fighting the elves head-on. Once this general principle was set, the rest was easy. With the floating ship, it was much easier for them to enter and exit the Callan continent. Every time, as long as they had a clear target and accurate information, they could rely on the basic principle of finishing the battle quickly and running after shooting. It would not be so easy for those stubborn elves to surround and capture them. The previous 2 raids by the Dark Witches had caused a lot of damage to the elves. However, without a huge combat platform and logistics base like the floating ship, it was difficult to maximize the harvest of each battle. They could not bring back all the elven prisoners of war, so they could only choose some of the highest quality ones to take away. If they could not take enough resources, they could only burn the rest. Now that they had the floating ship, these problems would no longer be a problem. The only difficult problem was how to choose a target to attack. If they could successfully besiege an elven town and capture all the elves inside, then Ulther's first mission would be completed immediately. So when Alice proposed to attack the unguarded elven villages on the west coast, Ulther immediately objected. We now have the floating ship. Our biggest advantage is the stealth and suddenness of the surprise attack. If the elven kingdom is unprepared, they will inevitably lose sight of one thing. So the first attack is often the one with the highest chance of success. Rather than wasting our first attack on a small elven village with no resources and no elites, we might as well go big and devour the entire elven town. The more Ulther spoke, the more excited he became. In the end, his voice almost became a piercing scream. But the defense of the elven town is also far stronger than that of an ordinary elven village. As far as I know, most elven towns are protected by Treant warriors and powerful unicorns. These are natural creatures that can rival elite Tier 1 wizards. Also, there will definitely be a lot of Tier 2 elves in such a town. What if? Alice raised a lot of objections in one breath, but her tone was not very firm. Ulther sneered and said, I've already seen it. There are quite a lot of metal puppets on this floating ship. With them, ordinary elves will no longer be a threat. Even the Treants and unicorns will have a hard time killing them quickly. With the metal puppets as meat shields, these witches will be enough to wipe out the elves' defenses. Seeing that Alice was still hesitating, Ulther could not help but roar. If there really is someone stronger than Tier 2, you don't have to worry about her. Just leave her to me. However, I want 2/3 of the captives first. What a greedy lion, asking for 2/3 of the elven captives, just like that. Did he really think that his identity as a Tier 3, which was a golden sign? Grim cursed inwardly, but his face remained calm and indifferent, as if he didn't care at all. This Ulther was eager to complete his mission, and he and Alice were also eager to take advantage of the situation and tie this Tier 3 Dark Witch to their worship as soon as possible. Unfortunately, in front of these cunning witches, any impatience or eagerness would arouse their suspicions. Hence, Grim did not say or do anything, leaving everything to Alice. As for Ulther's idea, Alice had already agreed to it a long time ago. However, in order to avoid the other party's suspicions, she could only suppress her joy and slowly deal with the other party. In the end, after a round of bargaining, the two parties finally reached an agreement on the target of the attack. Jintha Alor. This was an elven town located at the junction of the west and south coasts, 1,700 kilometers deep into the Sangaren continent. It had a permanent population of 700 people and an elven garrison of 200 people. These 200 people were made up of pure elite warriors and high-grade natural creatures, unlike the elven villages where the number of flower fairies was used to attack. Apart from 120 sword dancers, there were also 20 druids and 50 elven archers in their team. In addition, there were also 7 treant warriors and 3 unicorns. According to the information gathered by the Dark Witches and Destiny Witches, there were about 7 Tier 2 powerhouses. The captain of the Elven Guards was a Tier 2 weapon master, and the vice-captain was a Tier 2 elven sharpshooter. There were also 2 Tier 2 shapeshifters among the druids. Among the 7 treant warriors, there was also a Tier 2 withered guard, which was a famous meat shield of the elven race. The 3 unicorns were a male and female with a cub, and they were both Tier 2 creatures. With the combined forces of the Dark Witches and Destiny Witches, if they wanted to take down this tough bone, they would have to plan carefully. Hence, in the next 5 days, the airship stealthily and silently floated high above the clouds, slowly approaching the prey that had been plotting for a long time beyond the senses of all elves. During these 10 days, the witches did not stay idle. Some were making poison, while others were preparing the cursed scepter. All of them were abnormally busy. Chapter 634. It was a quiet and peaceful elven town. Unlike human towns that mainly focused on trade, the elven town was more of a place for the warriors of the nearby elven villages to interact and train. Unlike humans, even an underage elven kid would have superb archery skills and decent melee swordsmanship. It was just that most elves loved art, music, flower art, dance, and so on, so they refused to become fighters. As forest elves who were naturally free, they could choose the direction they wanted to develop in, and no one could interfere with their free will. It was just that the higher-ups of the elven kingdom wanted to prevent the lower-level elves from indulging in themselves and causing the entire elven race to slack off. That was why a town-sized training ground like Jintha was set up outside the most common elven villages. Every year, the elven villages around Jintha had to send outstanding elven warriors and young elven boys and girls to this place for training. The former would become fighters and join the elven kingdom's army. The latter was similar to militia training, so that these young elves would not completely neglect the traditional archery skills that the elven race relied on. Hence, when it came to the level of elites, Jintha was definitely 10 times or even 100 times more elite than the surrounding elven villages. Some of the elites who completed their training here would join the proud elven army, while others would return to their birthplace to join the local garrison. Either way, it was a form of growth and strengthening for the elven kingdom. The whole of Jintha was built on a small hill with a relatively gentle slope. From top to bottom, from inside to outside, training grounds of various sizes could be seen everywhere, and the content of their training covered most of the aspects of the profession advancement. Of course, there was also a small elven tribe of 300 to 400 people in Jintha. They were not fighters, but commoners of the elven race. They settled in Jintha mainly to provide logistical support for the elven warriors who came to participate in the training. After all, Jintha was only a training camp at the border of the elven kingdom. Usually, there would be no more than 200 elites training there. If the same training camp was moved to the central mountain range, there would easily be tens of thousands of elites gathered together to learn from each other. As a standard training camp, Jintha also had a certain number of Pegasi, hippogriffs, and chimeras, but they were mostly used as training mounts. Thus, usually, Jintha's defenses depended entirely on the flower fairies and green fairies who were good at hiding. In the forest around Jintha, there were natural creatures that were close to the elves. As long as there was the slightest movement, their restlessness would be immediately detected by the flower fairies. These palm-sized flower fairies that could hide in budding flowers and behind large leaves were the best scouts the elves had sent out. As long as they existed, it would be very difficult for any foreign race to sneak into the elven settlement. Because of these advantages, the elves felt that they were safe as long as they hid in a forest. The elves didn't believe that anyone would be able to sneak attack them from thousands of miles away in their own home ground, in a magic forest where they were born and raised. Hence, the security of Jinthalor was even more lax than that of the elven villages along the coast. It was the time when the afternoon sun was at its brightest. On Jinthalor's uneven hillside, there were the figures of the elves training hard. Amidst the soft shouts and clangs of swords that rang out from time to time in the sword dancer training field, half-naked elven warriors with enchanting elven battle runes on their bodies brandished their long and shiny elven blades as they fought in groups of two. On the other side of the platform, which was slightly higher, was the shooting range for the elven archers. There were enthusiastic cheers from the young elves. Every time a comrade shot an arrow into the bullseye with cool archery skills, it would cause the crowd to applaud. On the slope of the hill, there was a Pegasus and Hippogriff's training ground. The little fellows who wanted to become elven knights climbed on the backs of the Pegasus and Hippogriffs in trepidation and rose into the sky with ear-piercing screams. As for the back slope of the hill, it was the gathering place of the Druid Order. Young Druids gathered there, listening to the teachings of the Druid elders and trying hard to understand the heart of nature. But most of the time, they would leave the camp and walk into the magical forest, eating and living with the nature magical beasts. This way, they would understand their habits and temperament. The Druid's wild nature transformation was learned through this method of observation and copying. More Druids even managed to recruit a powerful magical beast as their animal companion after spending some time together. This way, when he stepped onto the battlefield again, he would have a solid and reliable figure to accompany him in battle. The giant floating ship flew high above the clouds. Because the weather was too good, most of the clouds were light and thin, so the giant floating ship had to be very careful not to expose its huge metal body. Standing on the edge of the ship, the witches used their own means to have a panoramic view of everything that was happening in Genu alone below them. Looking at the energetic, youthful bodies, all the witches revealed grim smiles on their faces. They were indeed a bunch of ignorant and fearless little fellows. They did not seem to realize that their kingdom, their home, was already on the brink of war, and they had become prey in the eyes of others. While they were immersed in the illusory happiness and safety they had created, the war beasts had already opened their huge mouths, ready to swallow them whole. Dacila, take 5 archer magic weapons to the south of Jinthalor and set up an ambush. Dana, take your people and block the west. Nguja, take the canine devils and guard the east. Chef, take 2 destiny witches and guard the north. The rest of you will launch a surprise attack on Jinthalor and try to disrupt the order of the elves as soon as possible. The main force of the battle will be the combat magic weapons. Tygol, take 50 magic weapons and charge from the front. Break up all the organized elves. You don't have to be responsible for the subsequent cleanup and capture. You just need to rush to the top of the hill in one go. Sophia, take the rest of the Destiny Witches and follow behind Tygol. You'll be in charge of the second wave of attack. Zacha and I will be in charge of getting rid of the rank 2 creatures and powerhouses, Ender, before the battle begins. You must complete the work of poisoning. As for the esteemed Dark Witches, are you satisfied with this arrangement, Lord Ulthar? What do you think, Lord Ulthar? Are you satisfied with this arrangement? Grim arranged the positions of the people participating in the battle in one go. Although they were a little dissatisfied with seeing a wizard flaunting his strength in front of them, after listening to his arrangements, many of the Dark Witches had satisfied smiles on their faces. Even Ulthar laughed coldly in reply. Don't worry, wizard. When the battle begins, we Dark Witches will not be a burden to you. Sisters, it seems like some people are still worried about our strength. Later on, show your viciousness and strength, and let those stupid wizards go to hell. Ulthar's arrogant words immediately caused the Dark Witches to laugh coldly. One by one, the sinister-looking Dark Witches in black robes took out their magic staffs and scrolls, silently arming themselves. At this moment, the giant airship had already slowly floated above Jinthalor. Under Grimm's command, the huge metal airship surged with mana propping up several energy fields and defensive force fields before rapidly descending. Such a huge object suddenly appeared in front of them through the clouds. The metallic body of the airship shone dazzlingly under the bright sunlight, making it difficult to ignore. On the uneven training grounds and platforms of Gene Allor, many elves noticed the abnormality in the sky, shielding their eyes as they squinted to observe. However, just as they were discussing what this huge object that suddenly appeared was, countless black dots suddenly appeared on the rapidly descending airship, flying towards the surroundings of Gene Allor. The troops guarding the perimeter had already set off. Ender, release the poison, Grim said in a low voice. At this moment, Ender was sitting cross-legged on an empty space on the flight deck. The metal deck around him was filled with winding and mysterious runes, and streaks of pale green halos rose from the sorcerer's bracelet from time to time. Within the bracelet, there was a terrifyingly dense ball of green smoke. Lord Grim, I still need to borrow your poison spirit. The poison centipede Ender took out jet-black poison cakes from his robes, breaking them into pieces and throwing them into the sorcerer's bracelet as he smiled at Grim. Grim did not say anything. He lightly patted his waist, and the sorcerer's spellbook that was hung on a silver chain flashed with a green light, and a strange green puppet the size of a palm floated out of thin air. This puppet had eyes, ears, a nose, a mouth, and a nose. It also had hands, feet, arms, and legs, and its wooden body was filled with strange and gaudy runes. Seeing the plague-poisoned spirit, the poisoned centipede Ender, who always had a gloomy expression, had a kind smile on his face. When the plague-poisoned spirit saw the poison woman, it appeared in her arms in a flash, calling out Grandma, Grandma nonstop. A poison-type marionette. Ulthar, who was at the side, saw this and tilted his head to look at Grim. Kid, I didn't expect you to have some knowledge in the poison magic. You can hook up with another Witch of Death later. Grim could not be bothered with this fellow who had always disliked wizards. He only ordered in a low voice, Ender, do it. The poison centipede Ender responded, and immediately put the plague-poisoned spirit into the sorcerer's bracelet with a sinister smile. Chapter 635. At the same time, in the skies above the Jinthar camp, a terrifying human face formed from pale green smoke slowly appeared in the air. Death, plague, destruction, melt. In the name of the plague spirit, I curse you all. The terrifying face roared in the ancient Bystrinian language most commonly used by ancient magi. Logically speaking, none of the elves present should be able to understand it. However, as the hoarse and noisy curses entered their ears, all the elves inexplicably understood the terrifying words. With a flick of his finger, the terrifying face dissipated, turning into specks of green fireflies that fluttered downwards on the giant floating ship. The poisoned centipede, Ender, coughed violently, his already hunched body shrinking even further into a shrimp. After a long while, he finally raised his head and flashed a miserable smile at Grim. The plague has already been released through the curse. If my lord wants to send someone in, it's best if you come here first to collect an immunity rune. With that, Ender nodded at the plague-poisoned spirit. This little voodoo puppet-like fellow stood in the sorcerer ring and stamped his feet. More than 20 to 30 yellow brooches shot out, flying towards every magus present. The Scarlet Magus and the Witches of Destiny did not hesitate to grab the brooches and fasten them to their chests. The Dark Witches hesitated for a moment, but after confirming that there were no problems with their mental scans, they also put on the brooches. Let's go, it's our turn. As Grim tilted his head, Tygol, who had been standing at the edge of the floating ship, chuckled. He turned around and jumped into the Grade 2 magic weapon warrior, the Goblin Ripper, that was specially made for him. With a loud roar, he grabbed a noose and jumped down without hesitation. Asterisk thud, thud, thud. Asterisk like dumplings falling into a pot. 40 archer and 10 swordsman magic weapons followed closely behind Tygol, jumping down one after another. Sisters, today is a great day to reap the harvest. It's time for us to go. The Dark Witch Ulthar laughed coldly. leading a large group of dark witches on their flying broomsticks and quickly rushing out of the giant floating ship. "Let's go as well." Alice's face was somewhat pale, but her expression was as calm as ever. "This is also your first time stepping onto the planar battlefield. Be careful. Let's go." Although she was a little worried about her Destiny witches, Alice also knew that they would never grow up without experiencing the tempering of the planar battlefield. Compared to the dark witches who had been on the battlefield for a long time, they were simply a group of new recruits who had never touched a gun or seen blood. Perhaps after this battle, one or two of the witches of Destiny would leave their companions forever and die in this foreign land. However, the remaining witches were able to absorb nutrients from the blood of their enemies and companions, thus becoming stronger and more cautious. Therefore, Alice's gentle but firm gaze swept across the faces of her companions, who she had been with day and night. Finally, without saying anything, she turned over and was the first to fly off the giant ship. Jinthalor was in a mess. The witch's witchcraft of witchcraft brought unspeakable pain to the Jinthalor elves. All the elves who heard the roar could not help but tremble as the green fireflies entered their bodies. Their spirit, physical strength, resistance, endurance, and willpower all showed varying degrees of erosion. Those combat occupants who had advanced might only feel some physical discomfort, but they could suppress this abnormality by forcing their spirits. However, the ordinary elves who lived in Jinthalor turned over and fell the moment the green light entered their bodies. They twitched violently, as if they had lost control of their consciousness. For a moment, all the elves in the Jinthalor camp showed serious signs of the witchcraft curse. Therefore, the elves were in a mess. They did not know whether to save their own people first or to resist the terrible figures that were falling from the sky. A few druids with nature spells were chanting healing spells and dispel diseases loudly. As the chanting ended, a green beam of light enveloped the elves who were rolling on the ground. The powerful force of nature immediately expelled the plague bacteria from their bodies, allowing them to return to normal in an instant. Unfortunately, these elves had just stood up in doubt when a new green fluorescent light floated into their bodies. Thus, they fell to the ground in pain again after recovering and began to howl mournfully. The druids raised their heads in horror, looking at the green fluorescent light that was falling from the giant floating ship like raindrops. Their faces were filled with hatred. However, before they could roar and turn into birds to soar into the sky, a druid elder stopped them. "Don't be rash. The enemy is coming at us ferociously. We can't let them take us down one by one. Come, let's go meet up with Yudas and the rest." Halfway up Jinthalor, the Tier 2 Weapon Master Yudas rushed out of a spacious tree hall, his face filled with shock as he scanned the sky filled with green dots of light and the frightening figures descending from the sky one after another. He turned around and grabbed the young female elf wizard who was following closely behind him. He hissed, "Quick, quick, inform Seridan City that the metal monster is with us. Let them hurry up and send reinforcements." The young female elf wizard hurriedly took out a magic wand. However, no matter how much mana she poured into it, all she got was a strange, ear-piercing noise. "It's being disrupted. The magic message can't be sent out." The young female elf wizard seemed to have never been in such a dangerous and urgent situation before, and was so hurried that she almost cried. "These damned enemies. Looks like they're planning to catch us all in one fell swoop. Gather up, immediately send a message, and get all the guards to gather here." As Yudas roared, the flower fairy messengers flapped their wings and rushed out of the tree hall. It was a pity that these delicate flower fairies only had the strength of high-ranked acolytes. Once they came into contact with the green fluorescent light, most of them fell to the ground in pain. Only a few managed to flap their thin wings and fly away shakily. After all, the Magi still wanted to catch all the flower fairies in one fell swoop. Hence, Poison Centipede Ender's large area of effect voodoo was mainly used to weaken and cause disease. If not, these flower fairies and elves that had been infected by the plague would have died long ago. Asterisk dong dong dong. Asterisk large and heavy metal magic machines fell from the sky. Although there were ropes as a buffer, they still smashed through the flowers, grass, and branches along the way, creating deep holes in the solid ground. Amidst the screeching sounds of mechanical components, these magic machines stuck their hands into the ground and climbed out of the deep holes one by one. Since they had come prepared, the first attack team, led by Tygol, had fallen at the entrance of the Jean Allor camp. Thus, when they quickly gathered together, what appeared in front of them was a winding stone path that extended to the top of a small hill. Although there was also a dense sea of trees here, it was much thinner than the surrounding areas. Bright sunlight shone through the gaps between the swaying branches and leaves, leaving mottled shadows on the rocky path. Charge! Tygol's ear-piercing howl came from the Goblin Ripper's body, and this tall magic machine warrior took the lead and stepped onto the stone path. The lowest level of the Jean Allor camp was the training ground for sword dancers. These strong and vigorous male elven warriors rushed out of the camp, brandishing two long and shiny elven blades as they charged at Tygol. Asterisk BZZT, BZT, BC. Asterisk Tygol didn't even need to move. The archer magic machines behind him raised their arms, and a storm of metal bullets brushed past the Goblin Ripper's body, pouring towards the enemy. It was obvious that these magic machines had been controlled by the Goblin technicians to lower their muzzles during the battle. As a result, a dozen sword dancer warriors suddenly fell to the ground, their legs broken, and they rolled on the ground in pain. Grim, who was leisurely floating in the air, looked over from afar and frowned. He couldn't help but turn the snake-eye ring on his right pinky and softly send a magical message to Tygol. Tell the Goblin technicians to change the firing mode of all archer magic machines from barrage attack to sniper mode. If these elves were beaten to a pulp, just the cost of treatment alone would not be a small amount. Remember, when you're safe, you're only allowed to snipe the non-vital parts of the enemy. Don't kill them all. Tygol leisurely walked forward and quickly passed Grim's order to the Goblin technicians hidden among the archer magic machines. As a result, the continuous barrage of bullets disappeared, and in its place were the crisp and loud sounds of sniper fire. These sword dancers who had their legs broken were indeed strong elven warriors. When they saw the magic machines approaching them step by step, they immediately gritted their teeth and endured the pain. They gripped their elven blades again and crawled on the ground, wanting to slash at the enemy. Tygol leisurely strode forward, allowing his opponent to hack at the Goblin Shredder's pillar-like metal legs, causing sparks to fly everywhere. He controlled the Goblin Ripper's mechanical legs to gently push the crippled elves to the side of the road, and continued forward with the magic machine squad. Seeing that their charge was not going to work, the vigilant sword dancers immediately dashed into the forest, using the trees as cover to quickly approach the magic machine squad. Asterisk thump, thump, thump. Asterisk explosions rang out, and the trunks of the ancient trees that would take 2 or 3 people to wrap their arms around each other flew in all directions. Green liquid splattered everywhere. When hit by the berserk metal bullets, a terrifying wound the size of a bowl would appear. Even the thick and tough ancient trees could not withstand the continuous shooting of bullets. Amidst a burst of swaying branches and leaves and flying sawdust, the ancient trees creaked and collapsed one after another. However, with the cover of the ancient trees, the sword dancers still managed to get close to the magic machine squad. Chapter 636. The newly developed Goblin Ripper was a powerful magic weapon warrior. Its lower body was still made of the most stable spider-shaped mechanical legs, while its upper body was a majestic humanoid metal body with 4 strange mechanical arms. 2 of the 4 mechanical arms were equipped with rotating flywheels and metal drills, which were considered melee weapons. The other 2 were equipped with miniature energy cannons, which could steadily output energy bullets with an attack strength of 140 degrees at a rate of 3 shots per 5 seconds. The power of a single energy bullet did not seem to match the Goblin Ripper's status as a Grade 2 magic weapon warrior. However, Once it got close to the target and continuously attacked, even a Grade 2 sorcerer's defensive spell would not be able to withstand it for long. Moreover, with the activation of the miniature magic furnace in the Goblin Ripper's chest, the powerful magical weapons that the Goblin Ripper did not dare to install in the past due to its limited energy. Hence, with the stacking of a large number of magical weapons, the Goblin Ripper was basically built into a terrifying magic weapon of war by the Goblin engineers. The Goblin Ripper charged at the elven sword dancers at high speed, waving its 4 mechanical arms wildly. Coupled with the sudden burst of violent energy bullets, the elven sword dancers who only had the strength of a quasi-sorcerer were either sent flying, hit by the shockwave of the energy bullets, or simply sent flying by the Goblin Ripper's huge body. In the blink of an eye, 7 or 8 elven sword dancers were taken down by Tygol, their bones broken and tendons torn. Thud, thud, thud. The magic weapon warriors marched in unison, taking large strides over their heads and bodies as they continued to advance towards the top of the mountain. Meanwhile, the engineering robots following behind the magic weapon warriors swarmed forward, putting heavy handcuffs and shackles on all the elves before throwing them onto the goblin chariots. Around them, more than 20 metal eyeballs continuously circled around, preventing any elf from sneaking in and ambushing them. Fighting the unprepared with metal against flesh. The magical machine legion that was gathered in a formation was like a clenched iron fist, crushing the elven teams that were temporarily gathered for a counterattack without any difficulty. The Goblin Ripper, under Tygol's control, was equipped with a magic furnace, so it would never have to worry about running out of energy. Hence, it charged at the very front. As for the battle magic machines, they would retreat to the rear every 15 minutes to recharge their batteries. Anyway, there were many demonic machines, so there was no need to worry about the firepower being cut off. The dark witches who were hovering in the sky on their flying brooms leaned over to look at the invincible magic mechanical legion and exclaimed in admiration again. Sure enough, the witches of destiny were rich and overbearing. They had transported an entire group of metal puppets from the sorcerer world to this place to fight the natives. Just as expected, they were unscrupulous and unbridled. To put it bluntly, if that wizard was willing to spend more magical crystals, he could destroy the entire Jinthalor camp with just these magical machines. Of course, these magical equipment could be used to deal with low-level elves, but if they were to encounter high-level elven fighters, the price they would have to pay to win would be too great. While he was deep in thought, the first wave of magic machinery losses since the start of the war appeared. The attackers were a group of elven archers wearing thin leather armor and carrying scimitars on their waists. There were both men and women among them, and all of them had excellent archery skills and nimble bodies that ordinary people could not hope to match. They climbed high up in the canopy, leaping between the tall, ancient trees as if they were flying, as if they were walking on flat ground while shooting arrows with all their might. As elven archers who had advanced, they could activate a mystical force similar to inner force and attach it to their arrows to increase their lethality. If they were just ordinary arrows, even the sharpest armor-piercing arrowheads would not be able to penetrate the thick metal armor of the battle magic mechanical legion. However, under the barrage of arrows that shone with a strange light, the previously indestructible metal shell was now like tofu, penetrated by the arrows. Violent energy exploded inside the battle magic mechanical legion, causing its energy system to self-destruct. As a result, the 3 archer magic mechanical legions standing in the front row were destroyed by the elven archers one after another. This time, even without Grimm's order, the goblin technicians hidden in the group quickly gave the order. In the next moment, the barrage of bullets that had not been seen for a long time appeared once again, covering the sky and earth as they shot towards the canopy of the ancient trees that the elven archers were hiding in. The giant trees shook, branches snapped, and with splinters flew everywhere. The screams of the elven archers who were shot could also be heard. It could not be helped. Regardless of gender, the elven archers were too delicate and frail. Even with the protection of tough leather armor, they could not withstand the impact of the barrage of bullets. With their bodies, one shot was enough to render them powerless. If he was hit by 2 spears, his body might even be broken. As soon as the might of the Archer Magic Mechanical Legion was displayed, the elven archers could not even find a stable footing. They could only grit their teeth and quickly move between the ancient trees. Although the arrows they shot out were still powerful, they could not achieve the same effect as before. This was a group of slaves with good qualities. It would be a pity if they were killed by the Magic Mechanical Legion. Hence, Ursaway nodded. The 3 grade 1 dark witches pressed on their broomsticks and rushed into the forest. Since the dark witches had interfered, Tigil naturally did not want to compete with them. The Archer Magic Mechanical Legion immediately stopped firing and continued advancing into battle formation. The remains of the 3 Magic Mechanical Legion that had been blasted into smithereens were carefully collected by the engineering robots at the back. The 3 dark witches rode on their flying broomsticks, arrogantly turning left and right in the lush mountain forest. Their mouths were constantly letting out cold laughter, as if they had nothing to fear. A female elven archer with short green hair was obviously not used to the arrogant and despotic behavior of the other party. She hid in a dense canopy of trees and took advantage of the moment when a dark witch riding a broom passed by her not far away to shoot an arrow. The arrow hit the spot between the witch's brows that was not covered. Seeing the archer's battered body stumble down from the sky, the elven archer's heart was filled with the joy of revenge. However, just as she stood in place, savoring the joy of revenge, she suddenly heard the urgent cries of her companions from another ancient tree nearby. Ferna, run, run! Why did she have to run? Before the green-haired elf could understand, a hazy figure slowly appeared from the shadows of the canopy behind her. With a light smack, a ray of black light struck the green-haired elf's body, immediately paralyzing her and making it hard for her to move. In the next second, a soft and sticky dark figure wrapped around her body. It crouched by her ear and laughed coldly. Kikik, pitiful little fellow, how did it feel to kill me? Do you want to have a taste? Before she could reply, a large mass of shadows surged forth, immediately dragging the green-haired elf archer into a vast and deep darkness. Moments later, the darkness dispersed, and the female elf's figure could no longer be seen in the canopy. Most of the so-called dark witches had already turned into shadow constitutions. Their bodies no longer had any fatal weaknesses. In order to kill a dark witch, apart from saturated magic damage, normal physical attacks were basically useless. Thus, even though the 3 dark witches were only at grade 1, they were fearless against more than 20 advanced elven archers, grade 1. They even made use of their strange physical immunity and powerful shadow movement abilities to kill their opponents, catching them off guard. If it wasn't for the powerful elven archery skills that could trigger witchcraft-like energy attacks, the dark witches would have already appeared and killed them all if they were pushed too far and could easily trigger a mutual destruction attack from the other party. Now, the 3 dark witches flickered in and out of sight, using their shadow leap ability to wander around the elven archers. Once they found an opportunity, they would use shadow force to paralyze their opponents and drag them into the Shadow Kingdom. Using this method, the 3 dark witches slowly but efficiently nibbled away at the number of elven archers. The elven archers that had gathered together tried to attack, but to no avail. Even the most powerful elven archery skills could not instantly kill one of them with a saturated attack. Then, the dark witches could rely on the omnipresent shadows to repair and heal themselves. After losing 8 of their comrades, the remaining elven archers could no longer bear the pressure. They whistled and sprinted along the rugged mountain path towards Jean Allor. At this moment, a team of elite elves had quickly gathered in front of the grand tree, hall halfway up Jean Allor. As for the elven archers that had escaped, they seemed to be heading to rendezvous with the team. The enemy has appeared. Don't just stand there and do nothing. Go down and capture those elven archers. Ulthar looked down at the battlefield and finally gave his subordinates an order. Yes. The dark witches bowed in unison. Apart from a grade 2 dark witch that remained behind Ulthar, the other dark witches sneered and dove down from the sky, pouncing on the elven archers that were wandering around the ancient tree canopy. Grim turned into a tall, flaming man as he stood in the sky, silently observing the enemy formation in front of the tree hall. The most eye-catching part of the enemy formation was naturally the 7 tall, ancient Ents. Their torsos were around 7 meters tall, and even the 3 to 4 meter tall combat magical machines were dwarfed by them. The originally withered and shriveled tree bark had turned into layers of incomparably tough tree armor, and the originally verdant tree crown had turned into their long hair that was fluttering in the wind. A few cracks appeared on their tall bodies, and from afar, they looked like the eyes and ears of humans. Furthermore, these tall Ents had sturdy muscles, and their bodies were covered in circles of wood veins. Their lower limbs were covered in thick roots and tubers, and their arms were made up of thousands of branches, vines, and thorns. In particular, the 10-meter-tall withered tree guard was holding a tree so thick that it would take 2 people to wrap their arms around it as a temporary weapon. Chapter 637. The 7 Ents stood side by side, instantly erecting a wooden wall in front of the elves. Behind them stood 3 holy unicorns, 2 large and 1 small. They looked like handsome white horses. Apart from their hooves, the rest of their bodies were snow white. Their bodies rippled with a strong, holy aura, and the jade-white spiral horns on their heads shone with a milky white light. They seemed to have a holy halo around them. Wherever they went, the green fluorescence of the plague bacteria would automatically disappear, unable to drift within 20 meters of them. Hence, under their protection, a large number of elven civilians hid in the tree hall, unaffected by the plague curse. Seeing such a miraculous detoxification effect, many of the witches could not help but feel a little excited. Their gazes towards the 3 holy unicorns were filled with greed and passion. The little unicorn seemed to be affected by the increasingly heavy atmosphere. It kept tapping its front hooves, looking anxious and uneasy. The female unicorn moved closer to it and nudged it with her nose, shielding it behind her. Above the tree hall, the Grade 2 weapon master stood tall. He only wore simple leather armor, and his hands were lightly waving a strange weapon, the crescent blade. It was a strange weapon shaped like a crescent moon. The curved surface was almost entirely sharp, and there was only a small handle at the back. Whenever the crescent blade danced and spun, it could inflict terrifying cutting and cutting damage to the enemy. It was especially good at breaking armor. However, because it was extremely difficult to control, only elven warriors at the level of a weapon master would dare touch it. Beside the weapon master stood a beautiful female elf with a slender figure. She held a giant bow in her hand and nocked an arrow. The tip of the arrow was condensed with a strong magical luster. This was probably the Grade 2 elven sharpshooter who was acting as the vice captain of the garrison. Grimm's eyesight was very good, and he could see a group of druids behind the elves. They wore green robes, wolf helmets, eagle helmets, deer helmets, and various other helmets. They held tall oak staves in their hands that were surrounded by the green light of nature. Each of them stared at the battlefield with a determined look on their faces, as if they were itching for a fight. They were probably the only group of elves who did not show any signs of fear. According to the information Grimm obtained, the Faron Plains classification of creatures was similar to that of the Sorcerer World. The only difference was that the strength of the Faron Plain was slightly lower than that of the Sorcerer World. At least, among the elven warriors that Grimm encountered, their basic levels were as follows: Flower Fairy, Intermediate Apprentice; Green Fairy, Grade 1. Flower Fairies were good scouts or scouts. Unfortunately, their bodies were too weak, so it was rare to see a Grade 2 fairy or above. It was obvious that they had Grade 1 potential. Sword Dancer, Advanced Apprentice; Battle Dancer, Tier 1; Weapon Master, Tier 2; Weapon Grandmaster, Tier 3; Gale Sword Saint, Tier 4. This was an assassin and warrior class with high mobility. They were adept at using quick attacks to quickly defeat their opponents, and could use their nimble body to dodge most of the enemy's attacks. Of course, this profession also had a huge flaw, which was that they couldn't wear heavy armor, which also caused their overall defense to be low. In order to make up for this disadvantage, low-level sword fairies would often draw confusing runes on their upper bodies to confuse and divert the enemy's line of sight. Elven Archer, Intermediate Apprentice. Elven Archer, Grade 1. Elven Marksman, Grade 2. Magic Archer, Grade 3. Phantom Ranger, Grade 4. Seriously speaking, Elven Archers were probably the only long-range attack force of the elves. However, considering the elves' racial talent in archery, all elves had excellent archery skills that other races would be envious of. Therefore, when a large-scale battle broke out, almost all of the elves were archers. If elven archers were compared to wizards, elven archers had the advantage in explosive power. However, the elven archers' fighting style was too simple and old-fashioned. If they really fought a wizard one-on-one, they could easily die under the wizard's endless strange witchcraft. However, if the location of the battle was in the magical forest, then the result would be unpredictable. Apprentice Druid, High Apprentice. Druid, Grade 1. Master Druid, Grade 2. Elder Druid, Grade 3. Master Shapeshifter, Grade 4. To put it bluntly, the Druids of the elves were a kind of jack of all trades. They could use nature spells, so they could be counted as half spellcasters. They could summon animal companions, so they could be counted as half summoners. They could transform into all kinds of ferocious magical beasts, more than enough to be half a meat shield. They could also wield melee weapons such as swords and sticks. They could also perform simple medical treatment, seriously speaking. As long as there was a vacancy on the battlefield, a druid would be able to fill it. Little Treant, High Apprentice. Treant Warrior, Grade 1. Withered Tree Guard, Grade 2. Ancient Dryad, Grade 3. Nature Herder, Grade 4. Strange natural creatures like the Treant were the biggest treasure that the magic forest had given to the elves. The elves had always been weak. They were either spellcasters or a group of agile warriors or archers. It was almost impossible to find a solid meat shield in the front line of the battlefield. At this time, the closest ally of the elves, the Treant race, was especially important. The Treants had a long life force and outstanding defense. They also had a terrifying recovery ability in the forest, so they were more than enough to be the frontline meat shield. Moreover, the Treants had the best defense skill, which was the entanglement of roots. Any enemy that entered the Treant's defensive area would be entangled by the tough roots that broke through the ground. Without great strength or the ability to teleport, the enemy that was entangled by the roots had no way to escape other than to close their eyes and wait for death. Therefore, even though the ordinary Treant warriors were only Grade 1, if they were to act ruthlessly, even many Grade 2 magical beasts would be left in the dust by them and would have to retreat. Young Unicorn, Grade 1. Adult Unicorn, Grade 2. Holy Unicorn, Grade 3. Guardian of the Grove, Grade 4. Compared to the Treants, magical beasts like the unicorn were much more powerful and difficult to deal with. The terrifying spiral horn on the head of the unicorn had a powerful, purifying, and dispelling aura. Once it pierced the enemy's body, it would also have a terrifying, blinding effect. Furthermore, the unicorn also had a strong magic-resistant skin. Most elemental spells would not cause much damage to it. Therefore, compared to the strength and terror of the Treants, the unicorn was much more difficult to deal with. Therefore, if Grimm had a choice, he would rather fight the two withered tree guardians alone than fight with an adult unicorn. Your witchcraft couldn't hurt it, but it could easily blind you, then kick and hit you. This kind of suffering made Grimm feel an inexplicable chill when he thought about it. Grimm observed the enemy's troops as he quietly waited for the magic machinery team to enter the battlefield. Along the way, the 51-man Magic Machine Legion only paid the price of 5 magic machines to reach the tree hall halfway up the mountain. Faced with the elves who were defending the hall, Tigul led his magic machinery team into the huge square in front of the tree hall. They lined up neatly and faced the enemy from afar. The Witches of Destiny, who followed closely behind the magic machinery team, gathered in a group and began to silently prepare their spells. The battle between the Dark Witches and the Elven Archers ended with the defeat of the Elven Archers. In the end, there were less than 10 elven archers who managed to escape back to the elven army. Together with the archers who were originally guarding near the tree hall, they could barely form a team of 25 archers. However, they also pulled over a group of ordinary elves to act as a backup team. This immediately increased the number of long-range attackers on the elven side to 100. The dark witches howled as they circled the sky on their broomsticks. From time to time, they would swoop down and throw a ball of shadow into the elven army. Unfortunately, the shadow corrosion was dispelled by the purification aura of the unicorns before it could take effect. After a few fruitless attacks, the dark witches could only curse loudly and return to the sky. With their strength, they did not dare to get too close to the two adult unicorns. Otherwise, if they threw a purification light at them, the Grade 1 shadow body would not be able to withstand the mysterious ability of the Grade 2 unicorns. It would be fine if their bodies were purified. At worst, they could just return to the shadows and form again. However, if even the spirit and will imprint in the shadows were purified, the dark witch would truly be dead. Demons from another world, leave our home. The weapon master glared hatefully at the dark witch, Ulthar. After all, she was the most powerful among them. Otherwise, I'll leave you here with your lives. Along with the elven commander's stern yell, many elven archers pulled their bows and knocked their arrows, ready to go at any moment. The rest of the elven soldiers also started to make a ruckus. Unfortunately, the Dark Witch's bluff could not stop these elven wizards who had come prepared. All of the elven wizards revealed disdainful and cold smiles as they began to move forward with their magic weapons. In the sky, the huge floating ship was also slowly descending. Dozens of black cannons extended from the bottom of the ship. This was obviously bullying the elven army in front of them because they did not have a powerful flying unit. They were prepared to use their powerful weapons to crush their opponents. The evil witches had crossed over to the other world to plunder the elves' population, land, and resources. Hence, there was no room for negotiation or reconciliation. Chapter 638. As expected, the battle broke out. The first to open fire were, of course, the long-range units of both sides. Just like the ancient wars between nobles, both sides unleashed their long-range firepower at each other from a distance of 150 meters. In this aspect, the wizards undoubtedly had an absolute advantage of more than 90%. Violent metal bullets and elven arrows shining with magical fluorescence crisscrossed in the center of the battlefield, clashing with each other. However, most of the attacks were aimed at the front line of the elves. Among the elves, the 7 tall, Treant warriors staggered forward and waved their wide arms made of thousands of vines, thorns, and branches. They stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the fragile elves. The metal bullets that were as dense as rain struck their wrinkled and thin wooden bodies, sending wood chips flying and green liquid splashing everywhere. Even so, the Treant groaned in pain as it tried its best to straighten its body to block the denser metal pellets. The elven archers who were hiding behind the Treant warriors dodged the bullets and retaliated with all their might. Angry arrows with ear-piercing screeches were shot towards the advancing magic machine army. Meanwhile, the druids at the back raised their oak long staffs and loudly praised the great spirit of nature. As they waved their hands over and over again, green halos of rejuvenation, healing, and natural recovery continuously rippled on the bodies of the Treant warriors. After all, this was the paradise of nature creatures, the great magic forest. As the druid repeated the process, waves of green nature energy that were visible to the naked eye spread out from the surrounding forests and plants. Then, they quickly gathered on the Treant warriors, healing and soothing their wounded bodies. A raptor druid master wearing an eagle helmet raised his long staff and used his powerful spellcasting ability to buff the 7 Treant warriors with a layer of thorn armor. This was a natural protection spell. Not only could it increase the defense of the Treant warriors, but it could also reflect some melee damage. On the other hand, A clawed druid master with a wolf helmet was buffing the treant warriors with a tree bark spell. This allowed the gathered force of nature to condense into pieces of tough tree bark that lingered around their bodies, helping them resist a portion of a long-range damage. Relying on the mutual replenishment and support of the elves, this seemingly inconspicuous elven troop actually withstood the wild bombardment of 40 archer-type magical machines and did not show the scene of collapse that they had expected. On the other hand, there were obvious casualties on the Magi's side. 10 defensive magic weapons with shields in one hand and swords in the other stood at the forefront of the battle, raising their alloy shields to block the incoming magic arrows. Yes, the arrows they encountered weren't ordinary arrows, but enchanted arrows infused with magical energy. These enchanted arrows were either enchanted with sharpness or armor-piercing effects, but most of them were explosive arrows that would explode upon contact. Therefore, when the 100 or so elven archers unleashed their skills to the fullest, such as double shot, triple shot, 5 stars in a row, storm, all sorts of fancy archery skills were unleashed. Together with the powerful enchanted arrows, the pressure on the Magic Machine Legion was unprecedented. In order to save costs and increase the efficiency of casting, these low-level magical machines only used high-strength alloy materials at the core, and the rest was just refined, ordinary magic iron. This kind of defense was basically enough to deal with most physical and magical attacks. However, when faced with the high-strength, high-density, and almost saturated enchanted arrows, they could no longer be as indestructible as before, especially the arrows shot by the high-level elven archers and sharpshooters. Not only were they powerful, but they were also very accurate and came from tricky angles. Even though the archer-type magical machines tried their best to cover the vulnerable parts of their bodies, the enchanted arrows still traveled more than 100 meters like swimming fish, passing through the crisscrossing metal arms and piercing the rotating joints of one of the magical machines with incomparable precision. There was a loud explosion. As the arrow exploded, a thick metal arm flew into the air. Looking at the opponent's amazing long-range archery skills, all the witches could not help but frown and intentionally or unintentionally widen the distance between them and the elven sharpshooter. That grade 2 elven sharpshooter was simply a god. She commanded the hundreds of elven archers to continuously bombard the Magi's troops with exploding arrows. Amidst the bursts of magical flames and waves, there would always be some magical machines that could not withstand the impact of the magical energy, and cracks would appear on their bodies. This was the time for her to make her move. She perched on top of a tall tree 200 meters away and used the method of projecting enchanted arrows into the cracks of the injured magical machines. Relying on this method, she actually destroyed 6 magical machines in just 2 to 3 minutes. This kind of battle result undoubtedly caused everyone to raise their eyebrows. Just as Grimm was secretly feeling a little distressed, the Witches of Destiny, gathered behind the Magi's troops, stood up. Under Alice's divine guidance, the Witches of Destiny used their magic wands to intercept and defend, and always managed to block the attacks of the elven sharpshooter. After all, the outer shell of the combat magic machines was made of metal, not paper. As long as the Witches of Destiny could find a way to destroy or intercept the enchanted arrows in advance, preventing them from piercing into the cracks of the magical machines and exploding, they would not be able to cause irreparable damage to the magical machines. Relying on this method, the Witches of Destiny successfully prevented the elven sharpshooter from continuing to expand her victory. Since these witches had chosen to follow Alice and successfully advance to become Witches of Destiny, their own spellcasting abilities would naturally degenerate. Although this would give them powerful foresight and prediction abilities, it also meant that the combat ability of the Witches of Destiny was the weakest among all the witches. Therefore, seeing that their combat magic machines could not quickly break through the defense of the Treants, Grimm and Draconid Zacha slowly descended and began to quickly prepare a large-scale fire spell. It had to be said that even if the whole battlefield was turned upside down and the strong foreign races gathered, the fire wizard was still the most powerful in the battlefield. With only 2 to 3 minutes of preparation, a large-scale meteor shower quickly formed above the elves' heads. Fiery red clouds quickly gathered in the sky, rolling and vibrating endlessly. Huge bubbles of fire that could be seen with the naked eye were faintly discernible in the clouds. With the rapid gathering of the fire elements, the fire in the clouds became more and more violent. Under the illumination of the demonic red evil light, the whole world became dark red, and the heat waves were scorching. Damn it, this is a large-scale attack spell of the enemy wizard. We can't let the fireballs fall. Quick, all the druids attack with me. Under the command of the eagle-armored druid master, all the Grade 1 druids raised their long staffs at the same time and threw their carefully prepared nature spells towards the raging fire clouds. The meteor shower that had been brewing to its limit was disrupted at the last moment by the group of druid spells. Bang! Following an earth-shattering explosion, the berserk fiery cloud could no longer maintain its witchcraft form and completely exploded. In the next second, a huge wave of fire that could make one's heart palpitate swept in all directions. This wave of fire was so huge that it almost engulfed both the elves and the wizards. On the side of the elves, 2 adult unicorns stood up, the spiral horns on top of their heads, emitting a dazzling milky white light. At this critical moment, they actually joined hands to create a natural barrier, protecting the fragile ordinary elves in the team. The raging fire elements were also mixed with the power of the entire druid group. Therefore, the energy surge and elemental berserk brought great pressure to the 2 adult unicorns. The pure white fur on the bodies of the 2 unicorns began to quickly dry up and fall off, and a large area of scorch marks appeared on their smooth skin. However, they were injured quickly and healed quickly as well. As the purifying aura washed over their bodies, these external injuries began to disappear at a speed visible to the naked eye. At the edge of the natural barrier, 3 to 5 elven archers' bodies, clothes, and hair suddenly burst into sparks, and it quickly spread to their bodies. No matter how much they struggled and screamed, these demonic flames could not be extinguished. Therefore, in a few seconds, they were quickly burned into a pile of ashes. Fortunately, with the support of the Trant warriors and the 2 unicorns, most of the elves finally survived the flame explosion. The same flame explosion landed on the wizard's side, but they were not as flustered as the elves were. The wizards did not need to divert their attention to take care of the magic machines in front, so they only needed to create an elemental barrier for themselves to withstand this flame explosion. The only reason why the elves were having such a hard time was because there were too many ordinary elves in their team who did not have the ability to protect themselves. The amount of energy required to create a natural barrier with a circumference of 2 meters and a natural barrier with a circumference of 100 meters were simply incomparable. Otherwise, no matter how weak the 2 adult unicorns were, they would not have been put in such a difficult situation by an ordinary Tier 2 spell. Seeing this scene, the eyes of the wizards on the scene could not help but brighten up. The weak, ordinary elves seemed to be the Achilles heel of the elves. If the elves targeted them, it would obviously cause great pressure to the elves. Therefore, in the next moment, almost all the witches started chanting large-scale magic spells at the same time, and the focus of their attacks was on the group of weak elven archers and archers. In the elven team, the faces of a few high-level elves instantly turned pale. Chapter 639. 3 large-scale witchcraft spells exploded among the elves almost at the same time. Frost Ring, Shadow Legion, Meteorite Descent. A huge wave of ice broke out in the center of the elves, and the boiling frigid air swept in all directions, freezing most of the ordinary elves in thick ice crystals. Only those with basic magic resistance could escape the pain of being frozen and break free from the wave of ice. The Shadow Legion that the Dark Witches summoned was a group of ferocious shadow creatures from the Shadow Plane. Shadow was different from darkness. It was a kind of energy that had no physical existence, and it naturally had spatial attributes. There were countless types of shadow creatures, and most of them resided in the shadow plane because there were no sun, moon, or stars there, only endless darkness. Of course, some powerful shadow creatures would choose to wander aimlessly between planes, and the chaotic energy between the planes was their natural nourishment. They were cunning, dangerous, and powerful, which was why they were loved and feared by summoner spellcasters. Shadow summoning was a very mature spell that could be strengthened from Tier 1 to Tier 4. The Tier 1 shadow summoning could only randomly summon some ordinary shadow creatures, such as shadow mastiffs, shadow snakes, and shadow warriors. The Tier 2 shadow summoning could summon a small team of shadow warriors. Although they weren't plain creatures, they were intelligent creatures with basic intelligence. As for the Dark Witch's shadow summoning, it was a Tier 3 shadow summoning. The shadow summoning summoned a shadow legion of over 100 players. This shadow legion, which consisted of 100 people, could easily slaughter an army of 1,000 mortals by virtue of their physical immunity and defense. Of course, the shadow energy that made up the shadow creatures was also a kind of negative energy, and it was naturally restrained by the positive energy of the unicorns. Therefore, when the darkness dispersed and the massacre started, 3 dazzling suns, 2 big and 1 small, suddenly lit up in the boundless darkness. Of course, they weren't real suns, but the natural light of the 3 unicorns' spiral horns. Relying on the suppression of the 3 unicorns' origin, the Shadow Legion that had been slaughtering madly just now immediately retreated and hid in the shadows, no longer as fearless as before. However, at this moment, a huge fireball with a diameter of 5 meters fell from the sky with a monstrous sea of fire and terrifyingly high temperature. Its target was the tall tree hall. Before the fireball arrived, the heat wave had already swept across the ground. Everything on the ground became scorching hot, and the green color quickly faded away. The large space was only left with a fiery red and suffocating heat. Damn it! Damn it! Damn it! You're gonna kill all the elves. Ursa, the Tier 3 Dark Witch, cursed as she watched the battle from the sidelines. She raised her hand, and a thick black spear crossed the space of hundreds of meters and hit the huge meteorite that was falling rapidly. The meteorite instantly exploded into 4 to 5 smaller meteorite fragments, which rained down from the sky like a fiery rain. Now that the meteorite had shattered, it was no longer as powerful as before. However, the rain of fire still forced the elves to scatter in all directions, and their formation was thrown into chaos. Even the towering Trant warriors were filled with an indescribable fear of the fiery rain. Like the elves, they hurriedly fled to the edge of the battlefield. The elves' formation fell into disarray. As if someone had blown a horn to charge, the combat magic weapons launched an assault under the command of the gnome technicians. As the combat magic weapons charged forward, they rained down a storm of metal on the Trants, elves, and unicorns. Meanwhile, the witches patrolling the perimeter of the battlefield seemed to have discovered an opportunity to attack, and they quickly used various techniques to cut into the battlefield. These witches entered the battlefield in groups of 3 to 5, targeting the elven powerhouses that had fallen behind in their panic. Tigule controlled the Gnome Ripper, his target being the Tier 2 Withered Tree Guard. The Withered Tree Guard's body was covered in sharp thorns. It waved the giant tree in its hand vigorously, sweeping away the scattered fire rain. Even though it was already trying very hard, the dry and wrinkled body of the ancient tree still ignited with sparks of flames. The Withered Tree Guard was at least 10 meters tall, while the Gnome Ripper was only 5 meters tall. Thus, when Tigule controlled the Gnome Ripper, his 5 pairs of spider-like metal legs madly charged at the Withered Tree Guard. As it charged, the Gnome Ripper brandished its 4 metal arms. A metal flywheel and an alloy drill spun madly, producing a loud, ear-piercing noise. Meanwhile, the 2 magic energy cannons unscrupulously opened fire, drowning the Withered Tree Guard's enormous body with terrifying energy bullets. In truth, if Tigul had a choice, he definitely wouldn't want to fight a 10-meter-tall monster alone. However, looking at the entire camp, he was the only one who could compete with the withered tree guard in terms of size and strength. Thus, even if he pinched his nose, Tigul could only howl as he collided with the withered tree guard. Of the two monsters, one was larger, but it was a withered tree that had come alive. The other was only half the size of the withered tree guard, but it was a solid metal puppet, a magic construct. When these two fellows collided with each other, a wild melee immediately broke out. One had a wooden fist, while the other had a steel fist. The two humans collided, rolling and smashing their fists at each other's heads. Thud, 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 thud. Visible cracks appeared all over the withered tree guard's body. One had a wooden fist, while the other had a steel fist. The other withered tree guard was still madly drilling with its flywheel and drill, bombarding it with energy bullets at close range. Although both sides were Tier 2, when they fought, there was a clear difference in their combat power. Through Grimm's AI, chips scanning, the basic data of the two creatures slowly unfolded in front of him like a book. Goblin Ripper, Tier 2 Magic Machine Warrior, 5 meters tall, 17 tons in weight. Core Power Source, Magic Furnace, small. Magic Weapons, 2 magic cannons, 1 metal flywheel, 1 alloy drill, 24 goblin missiles, 1 energy field generator, 1 anti-gravity levitation device. The basic combat power is as follows. Strength 27, Vitality 34, Agility 18, Spirit 11. Withered Tree Guard, Tier 2 Trant, 10, 7 meters tall, 8 tons in weight. The basic combat power is as follows. Strength 24, Vitality 27, Agility 9, Spirit 13. Looking at the basic data of the two, Grimm suddenly had an epiphany. Although the withered tree guard's strength was similar to the Goblin Ripper's, its vitality and agility were far inferior. A Level 2 creature, like it was classified as a Level 2 creature based on its body's basic data, and not from the perspective of comprehensive combat strength. Therefore, the withered tree guard only had the form of a Tier 2 creature, but it did not have the soul of a Tier 2 creature. It was a Tier 2 creature with a strong physique, but a weak soul and consciousness. On the other hand, the Goblin Ripper had the same basic stats as a Tier 2 creature, and it was controlled by a top-notch goblin mechanic like the Goblin War God, Tigul. Therefore, the combat power displayed, as well as the use of its basic stats, were far superior to the Goblin Ripper. If not for the green vines and thorns on the withered tree guard's body wrapping around the Goblin Ripper's arms like snakes, preventing it from moving too much, and the thick roots from the ground curling up from time to time, restricting the Goblin Ripper's movements. With the difference in their combat power, the Goblin Ripper only needed half an hour to destroy the withered tree guard's body. From Grimm's understanding, no matter how strong the withered tree guard was, it was just a slightly stronger soldier. On the other hand, the Goblin Ripper was a general, a hero. The two could not be mentioned in the same breath. Since the battlefield was getting more and more chaotic, Grimm did not bother commanding anymore. After all, the more chaotic the battlefield was, the more advantageous it was for his side. After all, in terms of individual combat power, his combat equipment could completely crush the opposing elves. Therefore, Grimm transformed into a 4-meter-tall, flaming man, leisurely strolling in the center of the battlefield. His bright yellow fiery eyes were constantly searching for his opponent. Such an eye-catching target naturally attracted some opponents who overestimated their own capabilities. TSS, TSS, TSS. 3 consecutive arrows pierced through the lava shield in front of Grimm, exploding it into a rain of lava. Grimm's fiery eyes swept across. It was the Tier 2 elven sharpshooter. She was stepping on the tall, ancient trees, leaping on the soft and slender branches. While rushing toward Grimm, she quickly pulled the bowstring. After the 3 consecutive arrows, she fired another 2 consecutive arrows. This time, the arrows were imbued with more power, and their penetrative power was a lot sharper than the last time. Ha! Grimm laughed wildly, You alone are no match for me. Why don't you call him over as well?" Grim raised his hand to protect his face as he spoke. The two enchanted arrows that were so fast that they could not be seen by the naked eye pierced deeply into the back of his hand and exploded. Grim's left hand, which was made of pure lava and flames, immediately had a huge bloody hole. Lava fragments and boiling lava immediately splashed out. Grim did not care about such a small injury. He was still laughing and waving his hand at an agile figure in the distance. A huge pillar of crimson flames quickly rose from the bottom of the figure's feet. With Grim's current strength, it only took him half a second to condense and activate the pillar of crimson flames. Even so, it did not harm the opponent at all. With a slight shake, the robust figure turned into a streak of light and flashed past Grim's side. Chapter 640. A weaponsmith, a godly archer. 2 grade, 2 elves. That's more like it. Grim looked up to the sky and laughed. Dense fire shields and a new lava shield appeared, tightly wrapping around Grim once again. "Come, all of you, come. Let me see what kind of trash you Farron Plains Tier 2 fighters are." As the pale red barrier of fire covered an area of 100 meters, the expressions of the 2 grade, 2 elves changed, and they retreated at the same time. Only then did they not get caught up in the barrier. However, while they managed to escape, the other small creatures were out of luck. Over 100 flower fairies and green fairies were flying around in the battlefield. One moment, they were howling as they weaved through the crowd, but in the next, they were like dragonflies falling into water, shrieking as they tried to escape this strange barrier of fire. Unfortunately, they didn't manage to escape far before their bodies burst into flames. Then, in the span of 2 or 3 fingers, the fire spread and instantly turned them into flaming birds. As plant fairies, the flower fairies and green fairies' fire resistance was negative. Therefore, when they encountered a master of arson, they did not even have the chance to escape before they were burned to the ground. Flames of various sizes appeared on the bodies of the elves and Trant warriors. Seeing so many of their nature companions being burned, the 2 commanders were extremely anxious. They could only turn back and keep the terrifying Balrog Magus at bay. If Grim was just an ordinary grade 2 Magus, he would have been chopped into mincemeat by now. However, after choosing to specialize in fire, Grim's control over elemental flames far surpassed that of ordinary magi. This was especially true after he had fused with many fire runes from another world. Grim's fire spells were even more mysterious and profound. Explosion, icy flames, poisonous flames. Grim sneered as he looked at the weaponsmith, who was constantly swinging his crescent blades to destroy the fire shields. He raised his hand and pointed, "Icy flames." With a flick of his finger, the flames surrounding the weaponsmith suddenly froze and turned into terrifying cold flames. A layer of greenish-white frost quickly spread across the weapon master's body. His limbs were stiff and cold, and he was almost frozen on the spot. Grim then pointed at the female elven archer, who was using the ancient tree to move around. Poison fire. The elven sharpshooter's body suddenly stopped moving, and she almost fell from the ancient tree because of her movements. Her pink and flushed cheeks suddenly turned green, as if poison had invaded her body. When both of them were hit at the same time, Grim shouted, "Explode!" As a mysterious rune appeared between Grim's eyebrows, the weapon master who was frozen by the cold flames and the divine archer who was poisoned by the flames groaned. A small-scale explosion of flames erupted within their bodies. Just as they were about to be injured, a milky white magic halo descended on their bodies, forcibly dispersing the elemental flames that were about to erupt. Damn it, it was those 2 unicorns. Grim roared and stretched out his flaming lava hand, grabbing at the weapon master who was right in front of him. However, the other party had already escaped from the control of the cold flames. With a flash, he moved away from his original position, and the 2 crescent blades in his hand spun like a windmill, slashing at Grim's wrist at a speed that was difficult to be seen by the naked eye. Howl! With a cry that was neither human nor beast, Grim pulled back his hand with all his might. The lava hand's front half had already been cut off by the other party. Scorching red magma gushed out of the broken palm like a spring, gathering into a small pool of magma in front of him. Grim angrily stomped his foot, and a huge ring of fire swept in all directions. The weapon master who wanted to take this opportunity to slash at Grim was pushed far away by the ring of fire. His body sizzled as the elemental flames burned him. What the unicorn had dispelled was the frozen status that Grim had placed on his body, but now he was being burned by the elemental flames. It was not an abnormal status, so it could not be dispelled. Grim wanted to take this opportunity to deal another blow to the weapon master, but two enchanted arrows whistled through the air, heading straight for his chest. Damn it, the female elf had also escaped. Grim opened his mouth and spat out a huge flame, condensing it into a solid flame shield in front of him. Only then did he manage to block the attack of the explosive arrows. Taking this opportunity, Grim activated the Heart of Flame, and pure flame energy flowed to the broken part of his left hand. In just a few seconds, a new lava hand was formed. At this moment, two milky white dispel halos landed on Grim's huge Balrog body, causing a large number of fiery shields to explode. Damn it! Damn it! Grim angrily roared toward the sky. Zacha, get rid of those two damn unicorns. After receiving the order, Dragonman Zacha raised his head and roared. He charged at the three unicorns, one big and one small. Anything it collided with along the way would suddenly explode under its incomparably violent strength, shattering into pieces. In one breath, he knocked down two ancient trees, trampled three elven archers, and knocked away a Treant warrior. Dragonman Zacha brandished his lightning spear and ice hammer, charging straight to the front of the three unicorns. The leading male unicorn took a step forward and used his spiral horn to block the frost hammer that was violently smashing towards him. The raging force of nature and the berserk force of ice collided between the horn and the head of the hammer. In the end, the two completely different elemental forces exploded, pushing the two people away at the same time. However, Dragonman Zacha's strength was clearly higher than the male unicorn's, so Zacha only staggered 2 steps before regaining his footing. The male unicorn, on the other hand, was sent flying more than 10 meters away, purple blood seeping out of the base of its horn. How dare you block my master's path? Go to hell. Dragonman Zacha, who had a better physique, was the first to recover. He swung his lightning spear, and a thick, winding chain of lightning shot out, targeting the male unicorn. With a long neigh, the female unicorn that was hiding to protect her cub saw that the situation was bad. She swung her horn, and a blinding light fell on Dragonman Zacha. Even with Zacha's extraordinary resistance, he couldn't resist this kind of racial ability that had a trace of the characteristics of the rules. So in the next second, he was dazzlingly blinded by his opponent. Just as he angrily swung his spear and hammer forward, the male unicorn crawled up from the ground, dived at high speed, and stabbed his horn deep into Zacha's abdomen. With the unique dispelling power of the unicorn, the wind essence armored draconian Zacha's upper body was completely useless. Even the tough and fine dragon scales couldn't resist the piercing of the spiral horn. Dragonman Zacha let out a roar that shook the entire arena. He threw away the lightning spear and grabbed Zacha's horn with one hand. Then, the frost hammer in his other hand smashed down with a whistling sound, bringing with it a sharp gust of wind. There was a dull explosion, and the male unicorn saw stars. Its 4 hooves went limp, and it almost knelt in front of the Dragon Man. Seeing that his opponent was still going to smash him with his hammer, the male unicorn stirred his horn with all his might, while urging the force of nature into his opponent's body. At this time, the female unicorn was afraid that her partner would be lost, and she rushed over with her cub at high speed. Just like that, 4 non-humans, 3 adults, and 1 child tangled with each other in the center of the battlefield. The fight was abnormally bloody, and the scene was too horrible to look at. Without the unicorn's interference, Grim could finally display his strength and fight against the two Tier 2 Druid Masters. Seeing their companions being dragged into the battle, the two Druid Masters with green braids roared angrily, intending to join the battle. However, at this moment, the two heard a sinister, piercing laughter coming closer and closer. The Tier 2 Dark, which had already swooped down on them on her flying broom. Due to the fact that their attributes countered each other, this Tier 2 Dark, which was more afraid of the two adult unicorns. So, she had been circling in the sky, not daring to enter the battlefield. Otherwise, if she was suddenly purified by the two unicorns, she could easily be killed with her shadow body. Hence, the Tier 2 Dark, which only dashed towards the two Tier 2 Druid Master Druid after waiting for the unicorns to be pinned down by the Dragonoid. Sneering, she charged at the two Tier 2 Druid Masters. As Tier 2 creatures, although the Dark, which was afraid of the unicorn's special ability, she was not afraid of the Druid's nature spells. After all, in terms of spell mastery and killing methods, the Dark Witch from the Sorcerer World was much stronger than the two Druid Masters. Even if she had to fight 1 against 2, she was not afraid. Tier 2 creatures fought against Tier 2 creatures. Naturally, the remaining ones were small fries who weren't as strong as the ones who were stronger than them. They might not have the strength to interfere in a battle between Tier 2 powerhouses, but if one side had the upper hand, the Tier 1 creatures would be able to put a lot of pressure on the Tier 2 powerhouses. In terms of the strength of Tier 1 units, the Magic Machinery Division was obviously stronger. It could be said that on the Elves' side, other than the 6 Treant Warriors and a dozen low-tier Druids who could cause considerable damage to the magic machinery, the rest of the Elves were basically harmless creatures. Their weak arrows and thin blades could not break through the thick shell of the magic machinery. Apart from being one-sidedly beaten and slaughtered, they could not retaliate at all. Chapter 641. The battle in the Jintha camp lasted for 2 whole hours. As the night gradually darkened, the battle cries in the forest began to die down, turning into a deathly silence. Due to the Magi's strategy and their preparations, the Elves' resistance had been reduced to a complete defeat in a short span of an hour. As for the remaining hour, it was purely used to deal with those troublesome Tier 2 creatures. As the leader of the Crimson family and the commander of this operation, Grim personally went into battle and experienced the thrill of torturing someone of the same rank. The treacherous and dangerous environment of the Magus world had nurtured a large number of terrifying magi who were adept at killing. Those who could travel to another world did not have any obvious flaws or weaknesses. In comparison, the forest elves living in the Callan continent and the Farron Plain had as many weaknesses as their strengths, and they could not be ignored. If this was a battle within the plain, they would still have an advantage due to their familiarity with the other party and the favorable environment. However, when they were faced with elite sorcerers who had crossed over from another world, the little bit of advantage they once had instantly vanished into thin air, becoming non-existent. The weapon master was agile, skilled in martial arts, sharp attacks, and shocking battle techniques. However, his body was too frail, and his magic resistance was not high enough. He could not even stand his ground in Grim's shockingly powerful fire barrier, let alone display his full strength. The female elven marksman faced the same problem. Her elven archery skills were indeed marvelous, and she could simply change the way she shot at the stiff and slow Balrog. It was a pity that her constitution was not up to par. Compared to the weapon master, her body was weaker and thinner to the point that she could be blown away by the wind. Grim's lava fireball or crimson flame pillar could reach a terrifying power that could overturn an area of 10 to 20 meters. The female elven marksman would be burnt to a crisp if she came into contact with this kind of fire spell, which had a power of more than 200 degrees. As such, her nimble body was mostly used to avoid the bombardment of the Balrog. As for stopping and calming down to deal damage, such a situation did not exist. Moreover, although Grim's flame demon form was a little slow, he had no problems fighting against the two of them by relying on his unpredictable flame leap. From time to time, The weapon master would sneak up to Grimm's side and give him a vicious blow, where the elven sharpshooter would go all out and use a terrifying exploding arrow to blast Grimm's flame demon body full of cracks. Unfortunately, under the pressure of the fire barrier and fire wizard spells, they were unable to gain a foothold beside Grimm and launch continuous attacks. All they could do was cut in and quickly retreat. Otherwise, just the stacked fire damage from the protective flames would be enough to make them suffer. In fact, the moment the two elves were unable to suppress Grimm's berserk flames, they had already lost. In most planes, fire spells are the most suitable innate talents for killing on the battlefield. If a grade 2 fire shaman like Grimm unleashed his elemental flames without restraint, the entire battlefield would become a stage for him to perform wantonly. Seriously speaking, the only thing that could stop Grimm's crazy attacks were the two adult unicorns. Unfortunately, they were tightly entangled by draconian Zacha and could no longer support the two elves. Moreover, to put it bluntly, even the two of them wouldn't stand a chance against a Tier 2 dragonoid with powerful strength, an insane physique, and outstanding magic resistance. If an adult unicorn had to be categorized, it would be a support-type, close-combat magical beast. They had too few offensive abilities, and most of them were cleansing and dispersing support abilities. Their main attacks were Spiral Charge, Blind Attack, and Trample Attack. Therefore, they were more of a close-range melee combo with blinding attacks. With this kind of strength, it was more than enough to deal with most of the stupid forest magical beasts, but it was a little clumsy to use it against a tyrannical Grade 2 Draconian warrior. Apart from some of the support abilities, the Draconian's strength and vitality could completely crush the unicorns. Once they went all out in close combat, the unicorns would only be at a disadvantage due to their single attack. If it wasn't for the blind attack that blinded Draconian Zacha from time to time, the male and female unicorns would have long been turned into meat floss by the Draconian. From this, one could see the difference in the levels of creatures from two different planes. A Grade 2 wizard from the Sorcerer world could easily defeat two Grade 2 elves from the Faerun plane at the same time. Against these weaker Grade 2 elves, it would not be a problem for him to beat up 3 of them. As for the Grade 2 Dark, which fighting against the 2 Grade 2 Druid Masters, the situation was similar to the previous 2. It was obvious that the Dark which had the upper hand. Even if the 2 Druid Masters transformed into a wolf and an eagle and attacked fiercely, they were still suppressed by the Dark Witch's various shadowy abilities to the point that they could barely breathe. When the small elven minions and characters were taken down and captured by the battle magic machines, the Grade 2 creatures of nature began to panic. Some wanted to break out of the encirclement, some wanted to stay and fight, and some wanted to capture the Dark Witch to exchange for their companions. With their morale in chaos, the battle that had been barely maintained collapsed one by one. The first to break out of this stalemate was still Grimm. As the patriarch of the Crimson family, the strength and resources he had accumulated were not something his opponents could hope to match. Seeing that the sky was about to turn dark, Grimm did not hesitate to use his first trump card, Grade 2 Elemental Puppet. Ever since he had advanced to become a Grade 2 Magus, he had been constantly on the move. He did not have much time to calm down and study his old profession, the creation of magic puppets. On the eve of this trip to the other plane, the AI chip had done a lot of calculations and optimizations, and finally came up with a plan to create Grade 2 magic puppets. While he was in the Cerubo family, he had hoarded a batch of Grade 2 elemental crystal cores. Adding on the ones he had bought from the Goblin Cabbie, he had a total of 23 Grade 2 elemental crystal cores. After working day and night, and failing 5 times in a row, the first Grade 2 elemental puppet was born. Terrifying Balrog. Indeed, the first Grade 2 elemental puppet that Grimm had created was a terrifying Balrog that had duplicated his own abilities and form. When Grimm released the terrifying Balrog, 2 Balrogs that looked almost identical appeared on the battlefield. Elemental flames gushed out of their bodies as if they had substance. They strode across the battlefield with thick legs made of pure lava and flames, swaying their 5-meter-tall Fire Lord bodies as though they were gods strolling leisurely on the battlefield. Wherever they went, they did not even need to lift a finger. Everything in the world would be scorched by the terrifying heat and elemental flames, turning into a sea of fire. The ground they stood on would also be burned to the point of cracking, and large amounts of lava and fire would gush out from the depths of the ground. With this grade 2 terrifying Balrog, Grimm's strength had instantly doubled. The two elves who had been barely able to hold him back immediately fell into a dire situation. The two Balrog roamed around the battlefield and set fire at the same time. The terrifying scene and the rolling heat waves caused the two elves' expressions to change drastically. They no longer had any hope of defeating this wizard. Now, they only hoped that they could protect their companions and break out of the encirclement. Unfortunately, even this thought appeared a little too late. In the past, when Grimm used Flame Jump, the two elves could still protect each other and escape from being hunted and hunted down. However, now that the two Balrog were charging at them, the weak elven sharpshooter no longer had the opportunity to escape. Her armor was set ablaze, and half of her long hair was burnt off. Grimm threw a lava fireball near the female sharpshooter, and a shock wave from the explosion knocked her unconscious. The weapon master wanted to rush forward to save her, but the terrifying Balrog seized the opportunity and whipped him to the ground with a flame whip. It then tied him up. The two Balrog were telepathically connected, so their coordination was as smooth as flowing water. Moreover, the terrifying Balrog's core contained Grimm's soul aura, making it easier for him to control it. Therefore, when they stood side by side, it was difficult to tell which one was Grimm and which one was the elemental puppet from their appearance and the aura they emitted. When the battle at the core of the battlefield was over, the battles at the periphery also began to come to a stop. The first to return was naturally the Grade 2 Goblin Ripper, controlled by Tigul. The Goblin Ripper that it was riding on was already in tatters. Its entire body was covered in cracks, scratches, and dents of all sizes. The metal flywheel on its upper limbs had been smashed flat, and the alloy drill was slightly bent. One of the 4 metal limbs on its lower limbs was broken, and sparks could be seen flickering in the wound. Although the Goblin Ripper was in a miserable state, its opponent, the Grade 2 Wither Guard, had been completely turned into a withered tree. The cracked and wrinkled wooden body fell to the ground. A large hole had been drilled in between the brows of the Gnome Ripper, and the 1,000-year tree heart had been dug out. The Gnome Ripper shook the 1,000-year tree heart in its hands. This was a 1,000-year tree heart that contained the power of nature. It was a precious magic material that many spellcasters could only dream of. According to the rules of the past, the loot from a battle belonged to the Magi, so Grimm only glanced at it and did not pay it any more attention. Who knew that Tigul would toss the 1,000-year tree heart to him? Master, this magic warrior still needs to be improved and optimized. I'll have to trouble you in the future. Tigul's hoarse voice came from the magic warrior with a flattering tone. Grimm smiled and did not say anything. He turned around and tossed the 1,000-year tree heart to the family's Magus, Drusilla, who had just arrived. He raised his head and silently looked at the night sky that was about to turn dark. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.